She didn't cry. That was the part nobody could understand. Every crime boss in the room watched Evelina Mero stand in that nightclub doorway, her husband's arm wrapped around another woman, cameras flashing, the whole underworld bearing witness, and she didn't shed a single tear. She just looked at Cassian Viscari with those dark, still eyes, nodded once like she was closing a ledger, and walked out into the cold. They all thought she was broken. Every single one of them was wrong. If this story has you gripping your seat already, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about power. The nightclub was called Obsidian, and it sat on the corner of West Meridian and 5th like a scar on the face of a city that had seen too much. 3 floors, black marble floors, bulletproof glass behind velvet curtains, and on any given Friday night, it belonged entirely to Cassian Viscari, boss of the Viscari family, king of the Eastern Syndicate, a man whose name people said carefully and quietly, even in rooms they believed were safe. It was a Thursday when the shooting started. Evelina heard the first burst of gunfire from the private corridor on the 2nd floor, where she'd been standing alone for the better part of 20 minutes. Cassian had arrived with Celine Cross 40 minutes earlier, Celine in a white dress that had no business existing in a room full of people who carried weapons, her hand resting on Cassian's forearm like she owned the geography of him. Evelina had watched them from the mezzanine rail. She hadn't moved. She'd held her champagne glass and watched, and the expression on her face was the same expression she wore when she was reviewing a balance sheet, focused, neutral, already calculating what the numbers meant. The shooting changed the geometry of everything. 3 gunmen came through the service entrance on the east side, automatic weapons, masks, moving fast. The first floor erupted, glass, screaming, the specific flat crack of rounds punching through drywall. Cassian's bodyguards were good, trained men who'd been in worse rooms, and they moved immediately. But in the chaos, in the spinning lights and the shoving crowd, Cassian grabbed Celine and pressed her behind him, shielding her body with his own, and that was the image that got captured. That was the photograph that spread through every encrypted channel in the underworld before midnight. Cassian Viscari, back exposed, both arms wrapping Celine Cross, protecting her. His wife stood 12 feet away with no one touching her at all. The gunmen were neutralized inside 4 minutes. 2 dead, 1 wounded and taken. The nightclub emptied of civilians with the practiced efficiency of an organization that had managed crises in public spaces before. Cassian's people sealed the perimeter. Medics arrived for 3 wounded soldiers. And Cassian, breathing hard, adrenaline still moving through him, turned and found Evelina watching him from across the lobby with those dark eyes and that particular stillness she carried like a weapon. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said. That was the whole conversation. She was gone before the police arrived, before the cleanup crew. Before Cassian had finished debriefing his captain, Marco Vitelli, a barrel-chested man with a scar through his left eyebrow who had served the Viscari family for 19 years, and who looked at the space where Evelina had been standing with an expression Cassian didn't read correctly until much later. The photograph was everywhere by morning, not just in the underworld's private networks, in the actual press, leaked through channels no one could trace. The tabloids ran it without context. The underworld consumed it with complete context. The caption, in the criminal world's informal shorthand, wrote itself. The king chose his mistress in front of God, and witnesses, and every family watching. 3 days later, Evelina Mero left the Vescry mansion on Aldermere Hill with 2 suitcases and no security detail. The staff watched her go. The cameras recorded her walking down the stone drive in a gray coat, not hurrying, not looking back. The iron gate swung shut behind her. None of Cassian's people stopped her because Cassian had not given the order to stop her, and by the time he thought perhaps someone should have asked where she was going, she was already gone into a city of 9 million people, and none of his considerable resources could immediately locate her. He told himself she needed space. He told himself this the way people tell themselves comfortable things when the alternative is too complicated to sit with. He was wrong about almost everything. Evelina had been raised in a family with no money and considerable intelligence. which is a combination that either breaks a person or sharpens them to a very fine point. Her father, Douglas Marrow, had been a labor mediator, a man who sat across tables from people who wanted to destroy each other and found the language that made them stop. He died when Evelina was 17. What he left her was not money. What he left her was the ability to read a room in under 30 seconds and understand what every person in it needed, feared, and would sacrifice to avoid losing. She'd met Cassian Vescari when she was 24 at a charity event that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with the wealthy criminal class performing civic virtue for each other. He was 31, already running the Vescari operations, already wearing the particular stillness of a man who has learned that physical danger is simply a problem to be managed. He was compelling in the way that fire is compelling. You could see the heat from across the room. They were married inside a year. What Cassian saw in her was intelligence and composure and a face that could sit across from federal prosecutors without giving away a single useful thing. What he did not fully see, what almost no one fully saw, was the depth of what she could build when left alone in a room with information and time. The first 7 years of their marriage were, by the violent standards of the world they inhabited, reasonably stable. Cassian fought his wars. Evelina managed the legitimate architecture of the empire, the holding companies, the shell corporations, the real estate portfolios, the charitable foundations that served as both reputation laundering and, occasionally, genuine utility. She was good at it, better than good. She restructured 3 collapsing front companies in 2019 alone, and did it in ways that even their forensic accountants took 6 months to fully appreciate. But she also did other things, quieter things. Things Cassian knew about in outline and didn't investigate in detail because the results were always favorable, and the empire continued to function and grow, and Cassian was, at his core, a man who cared about results and found the mechanics of diplomacy tedious compared to the clarity of conflict. Evelina had been building something for 8 years. Cassian had been living inside it without knowing it existed. The call came on the 4th morning after she left the mansion. Evelina was in a rented apartment on the west side of the city. Clean lines, minimal furniture, a view of the river from the 3rd floor. She'd bought it through a holding company that did not connect to the Vescari name. She'd held the lease for 3 years. She had never mentioned it. She was drinking coffee at the kitchen counter, reading through a series of encrypted messages on a modified phone, when her own secure line rang. The number belonged to a man named Aurelius Crane, Don of the Crane family out of Chicago, 63 years old, heavy-set, a man who had survived 4 assassination attempts and 2 federal investigations, and who carried the particular authority of someone who has simply outlasted everyone who wanted him gone. She answered on the 2nd ring. "They're watching his shipment routes," she said without preamble. There was a pause. Then Crane's voice, low and deliberate. "The Moretti crew. Northeast Corridor, they've been building position for 6 weeks. I'm sending you the surveillance logs." Another pause. Longer. "How long have you had this?" "Long enough." "Evelina?" His voice shifted. Something that might have been respect in a man less guarded with his emotional vocabulary. "You're not going to tell me you're just watching out for old friendships." "I'm watching out for balance," she said. "Same as always." The call lasted 9 minutes. By the end of it, the Crane family's security apparatus had been repositioned, 3 compromised courier routes had been abandoned, and Aurelius Crane had extended an invitation to a private meeting at a location of her choosing. She accepted. She chose a location. She disconnected and went back to her coffee. This was not new. This was what she had always done, in the spaces between what Cassian could see. The Moretti threat was real, and it wasn't aimed at the Cranes alone. Evelina had mapped it over 18 months. The slow accumulation of leverage that the Moretti family, out of Philadelphia, had been assembling against 3 separate syndicates simultaneously. It was patient work, sophisticated work, the kind of strategic architecture she respected even as she methodically dismantled it. What nobody outside her direct sphere understood was that Evelina had spent the better part of a decade doing exactly this. Not for the Vescari name, not for Cassian's authority, but for a more fundamental purpose, She believed, with the kind of conviction that came from watching her father negotiate peace between men who wanted blood, that the underworld's permanent state of cascading violence was not inevitable. It was a management problem, and management problems had solutions. She had spent 8 years quietly providing those solutions. The first major intervention had been in 2018, when the Delacroix family in New Orleans was on the verge of collapse following the arrest of their patriarch. Their second-born son, Remy Delacroix, was 26 and brilliant and completely unprepared to hold an organization together under federal pressure. 3 other families were already positioning to absorb Delacroix territory. Evelina had spent 11 weeks moving money through a series of legitimate financial instruments that gave the Delacroix legal operation enough runway to survive the federal investigation and emerge with their organization intact. She had asked for nothing in return. She had not told Cassian what she was doing. She had simply decided it was worth doing because the alternative, the fracturing of the Delacroix network and the war over its pieces, would create instability that would eventually cost the Viscari family more than the intervention was worth. Remy Delacroix was now 32. He ran the family. He had sent her a handwritten note the previous Christmas that said, only, whatever you need, whenever, no questions. There were 7 other families with similar histories, 7 other dons or heirs or captains who had been, at a critical moment, the beneficiaries of her invisible hand. A rescued son here, a diverted federal interest there, a financial bridge extended at exactly the right moment to prevent a collapse that would have sent ripples through the entire network. She had never called in those debts. She had filed them away with the precision of someone who understood that the most powerful leverage is the kind you never have to announce. She was announcing it now. By the 5th day, Cassian knew something was wrong, but he couldn't locate the shape of it. His captain, Marco Vitelli, came to him on a Tuesday afternoon with a look on his face that Cassian associated with news he didn't want to be the one to deliver. They were in the study on the 2nd floor of the Aldermere house, the room where Cassian conducted the actual business of running an empire, lined with secure filing systems and a communications array that connected him to operations in 11 cities. Crane canceled the quarterly arrangement, Marco said. Cassian looked up from the documents he was reviewing. Why? No explanation offered, just a withdrawal. That's $40 million in logistics. Yes. Cassian set down the documents. He looked at Marco for a moment. Get Crane on the phone. I've tried, twice. His people say he's unavailable. Aurelius Crane had never been unavailable. In 19 years, through wars and investigations and 3 complete restructurings of the Chicago operation, Aurelius Crane had always picked up the phone when the Viscari family called. It was a point of professional courtesy that both families had treated as close to sacred. What else? Cassian said. Marco hesitated. The Delacroix family declined the New Orleans port arrangement. Remy Delacroix, specifically, said they're restructuring their external partnerships. When did we hear this? This morning. Cassian was quiet. He was a man who had learned to think clearly under pressure. And what he was thinking now was that 2 significant partnership withdrawals in 24 hours, following a public incident at Obsidian that had generated significant attention, was probably not a coincidence. Someone's moving against us, he said. Marco's expression was difficult to read. Possibly, he said. Or what? Marco stopped, made a choice. Nothing. I'll look into it. What Marco had almost said and had pulled back from was, or someone is responding to a different signal entirely. But Marco Vitelli had served the Viscari family for 19 years, and he understood, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who had watched the machinery of power closely for a very long time, that there were things Cassian needed to discover himself. Some truths, delivered too directly, got killed by the messenger. He left Cassian in the study and went to make calls of his own. Celine Cross had arrived in Cassian's life 14 months earlier, through the specific gravity of beauty and calculation. She was 31, the daughter of a mid-level arms broker who had died, leaving her well-connected and financially comfortable but not wealthy by the standards of the world she wanted to inhabit. She was smart in a quick, social way, excellent at reading what people wanted from her, excellent at providing it. What she'd understood about Cassian Viscari almost immediately was that he was a man who had been managing an empire for so long that he'd developed a particular blind spot. He could not fully see people who weren't in conflict with him. The adversarial relationship was the one he'd been trained to map. Evelina had understood him through that lens too, which was why she'd never openly opposed him. She'd worked in the spaces he wasn't watching. Celine understood him through the same lens but drew opposite conclusions. The way to maintain position with Cassian Viscari was to make him feel constantly, subtly threatened by her potential absence, to make herself the thing he needed to protect. The photograph from Obsidian had been perfect, better than anything she'd orchestrated. The chaos had been real, the instinct real, but the cameras, the specific journalists who had those images within hours, the channels through which they'd moved, those had been her work. She had a contact at a criminal-facing tabloid who'd received a tip about the nightclub that night. The tip had included specific information about the layout of the private areas. Celine had not known anyone would get shot, but she had known cameras would be there, and she had known what Cassian would do when it went sideways, because she had learned his reflexes very well. What she hadn't calculated was Evelina's response. She'd expected tears, or a confrontation, or the kind of visible fracture that would force Cassian to make a choice and choose her. She hadn't expected that stillness. She hadn't expected the 2 suitcases and the gray coat and the iron gate swinging shut on recorded cameras. She hadn't expected silence. The silence was worse. She couldn't map it. On the 6th day, she went to Cassian. She found him in the study, which was unusual. He was rarely in the study at 9 in the evening. He was sitting at the desk with the communications array dark, a single lamp on, a glass of something amber that hadn't been refilled in a while. He looked like a man doing arithmetic in a language he only half remembered. "You need to talk to her," Celine said. He looked at her. "I didn't ask for your read on this. I know, I'm giving it to you anyway because I'm watching you run through scenarios and none of them are the right one." Something shifted in his expression. Not softness. Cassian Viscari had not done softness since he was 22, but a kind of focused attention, the way he looked when he was reassessing a variable. "What do you know about it?" he said. "I know that Evelina Marrow doesn't leave without a reason," Celine said, "and I know that you've been in this room for 4 hours because 2 of your major partners have pulled back and you can't figure out why, and the thing you're not letting yourself think is that she might be involved." The silence stretched. Outside, the city made its usual noise, distant traffic, a helicopter somewhere, the ambient pressure of millions of people doing things that had nothing to do with this room. "She's not an operator," Cassian said. "She runs the financial architecture. She's not—" He stopped. "Not what?" He didn't finish the sentence because he was thinking about something Marco had almost said. About how Marco, 19 years, the man who knew the Viscari machine better than almost anyone, had started to say something and stopped himself. About how Aurelius Crane's people hadn't said Crane is busy. They'd said Crane is unavailable, which was a different thing, a word that carried a different weight. About how Remy Delacroix's message had specifically named him, Remy Delacroix, specifically, as if making sure the right person was noted. "The architect," Cassian said very quietly. Not to Celine, almost to himself. Celine's expression didn't change, but something moved behind her eyes. She had heard that name. In the background of conversations at certain levels of the underworld, in the last 18 months, a name had surfaced occasionally. The architect. Whispered the way you whispered about someone you weren't sure was real or mythology. A fixer, a broker, someone who moved through the spaces between families and left things more stable than she found them. Nobody put a face to it. Nobody claimed a direct line. Cassian had heard it too. He dismissed it as a story, the kind of legend the underworld manufactured because the people in it liked to believe there was a hidden hand behind the things they couldn't explain. He was sitting very still now. "Find her," he said. Celine nodded. She left the room. In the corridor out of the camera's range, her expression shifted into something harder and more precise. The groundwork she'd laid was beginning to function the way she'd intended. Cassian's suspicion was flowering, and suspicion, in a man like Cassian Viscari, always eventually turned into action. She just needed to make sure it turned into the right action. She made a call from her personal phone, a number she'd used 3 times before, a contact she'd cultivated specifically for this kind of work. "It's time," she said. Plant the ledger. The ledger appeared on Cassian's desk on a Thursday morning, slid under the door of the study by a source his people could not immediately trace. It was a physical document, unusual in an age of encrypted digital files, which was precisely why it was effective. Physical things felt real in ways that files did not. It contained 40 pages of financial records, cross-referenced accounts, transfer histories, a network of holding companies and shell structures laid out in meticulous detail. To the trained eye, and Cassian had spent 20 years developing a trained eye, it read as a map of financial control. Whoever owned this architecture owned significant operational leverage over 6 major syndicates. The name on the primary holding structures was not Viscari. It was a series of names that traced back, through 4 layers of corporate nesting, to a woman named Elena Vero. A woman who did not exist in any public record, but whose financial signature, once you knew what you were looking at, was unmistakably familiar. Elena Vero, Evelina Mero. The transposition was not subtle. It was designed to be found. Celine's contact had done clean work. The documents were genuinely sophisticated, the kind of thing that would take a forensic accountant weeks to fully unpack, and in the time it took to unpack them fully, Cassian would have already reacted. Cassian looked at the documents for a long time. He was not a man who panicked. He was a man who assessed. But the assessment kept arriving at the same place, and the place felt like the floor dropping away under an empire he'd believed was solid. He called Marco. Marco came. He looked at the documents. His face, usually managed and careful, showed something Cassian didn't fully register in that moment. Something that wasn't quite surprise. "What do you need from me?" Marco said. "I need to know if this is real." Marco was quiet for 3 seconds. "I'll find out." "And I need to find Evelina." Marco nodded. He took the documents. He left. And for the second time in a week, he didn't finish a sentence he'd started. And Cassian didn't notice because he was already thinking about the next move in a game he was just beginning to understand he hadn't designed. They found Evelina on a Friday evening, not through their own investigative work, through a message she sent to Marco's private line, which meant she'd known they were looking before they'd fully committed to looking. The message contained an address and a time. Marco showed Cassian the message. Cassian looked at it. The address was on the west side of the city, a building he didn't recognize. The time was the following morning. "She wants to meet," Marco said. "I'm aware of what it means." "Cassian," Marco's voice was careful, precise, the voice of a man choosing each word. "Before you go into that room, there are things I should have told you, Marco. Weeks ago, maybe longer, Marco." Cassian's voice was flat and final. "Not now." Marco stopped. His jaw tightened. He was a man who understood that some doors, once shut, stayed shut. 8 o'clock, Cassian said. "Have the car ready." He walked out of the study, and Marco stood alone with the documents and the message and the particular weight of knowing things that the wrong person hadn't yet figured out, and knowing that the window for saying them cleanly was probably already closed. By the time Cassian arrived at the West Side building the next morning, 4 of his 7 regional captains had stopped responding to direct communications. The 5th, when reached, said only that he was reassessing his operational alignment, a phrase so out of character for a man who had spent 17 years in the most direct possible employment that Cassian sat with it for a full minute before the car moved. He walked into the building. The lobby was clean, minimal, unmanned, an elevator waiting open. He rode it to the 3rd floor. The apartment door was unlocked. Evelina was sitting at a kitchen counter, drinking coffee, looking at her phone. She didn't look up immediately when he came in, and in that half-second before she acknowledged him, Cassian had the singular experience of feeling like he was the one who had arrived unannounced in someone else's territory. Then she looked up. Those dark, still eyes. No anger in them, which was somehow worse than anger. "Cassian," she said. "You're running something," he said. "I need to know what it is." She set down the phone. She looked at him with an expression that was almost, not quite, patient. "I've always been running something," she said. "You just stopped paying attention." And then she told him the first part of it. Not everything, nothing like everything, but enough. Enough to watch his face go through the specific sequence of a man who is revising a map he'd thought was accurate and finding that the revision keeps expanding, keeps requiring more territory, keeps revealing that the edges of what he knew were nowhere near the actual borders. When she finished, the coffee in front of her was cold, and outside the window the river moved in its slow, permanent way. And Cassian Vescari, king of the Eastern Syndicate, sat in a chair in his wife's unremarkable rented apartment and understood for the first time that the empire he'd believed he was running had always had a second architecture beneath it. Built by the woman he'd dismissed, protected by her silence, held together by debts he hadn't known were being accumulated, in his name and not in his name, by someone who had watched him fight his wars and quietly ensured there was still something worth fighting for when the fighting was done. The families, he said, the ones pulling back, that's you. That's them making a choice, she said. I didn't instruct anyone. I simply made myself available. Available. The word landed with a dry, heavy sound. Cassian. Her voice didn't rise. It never rose. I didn't leave because I was broken. I left because... She paused. Not for effect. Pausing because the next words needed to be accurate. Because I needed you to feel the weight of what you've been standing on. He looked at her for a long time. The ledger, he said. Someone put a ledger on my desk. Something shifted in her expression. Slight, almost invisible. What ledger? It was not a question. It was the specific non-question of someone whose information just collided with something they didn't expect. Financial records, he said slowly, watching her face. Showing a control structure, under a name that's close to yours. The stillness in her didn't change, but underneath it something moved, and Cassian, who had spent 20 years reading rooms, caught it, caught the exact texture of it. This was not guilt. This was not exposure. This was the expression of someone who has just identified a threat they hadn't known was in the room. I didn't create any ledger, she said. The sentence sat between them like a third person. Then someone else did, Cassian said. Yes, she said, and for the first time since he'd walked into the apartment, they were looking at each other without the architecture of 14 months of distance and damage between them, but with something more fundamental. Two people who had spent years as the most intimate adversaries, suddenly oriented toward the same unknown. Someone who wants us against each other, she said. Who benefits from that? She didn't answer immediately. She picked up her cold coffee, looked at it, set it down. When she looked back at him, there was something working behind her eyes, the financial architecture of a mind that had been running calculations for 8 years. Someone who's been close enough to watch how we work, she said. Someone who knew which documents would land hardest. Someone who needed you to come after me before I could... She stopped. Cassian waited. Before you could what? He said. But she was already reaching for her phone, already unlocking it, already scrolling to something with the focused speed of a woman who has just understood that the clock on something important has changed, and the window she had has just become significantly smaller than she'd calculated. And somewhere in the city a third party was watching the board and preparing to move while both of them were still in this room. We need to make a call, she said. Now, before tonight. Evelina, Cassian. She looked up at him, and for the first time since the nightclub, since the photograph, since the iron gate, there was something in her eyes that wasn't cold and wasn't still, something urgent and precise, and underneath both of those things, afraid. Someone built a trap, and it wasn't for me. She held up the phone. The name on the screen, the contact she was preparing to call, was not a name Cassian recognized, but the family identifier attached to it, the prefix that indicated affiliation in their network's informal coding system, sent a cold current through the room. It was the Moretti prefix, and it was in Evelina's phone as a saved contact. Cassian looked at the screen, he looked at her face, he looked at the screen again. How long? He said. Long enough to know they're not the ones who sent you the ledger, she said, and long enough to know who did. She pressed call. The line opened, and in the silence before the other end picked up, Cassian understood that the war he'd been mapping for the past week was not the war that was actually happening. And the enemy he'd been building to fight was not the enemy he needed to be facing. And somewhere in his city, tonight, something was already in motion that neither of them had fully stopped yet. The line connected. "We have a problem," Evelina said into the phone, and the voice that answered was not who Cassian expected. The voice on the other end of the line belonged to a man named Dario Fenn. Not Moretti family, not an enemy, but a forensic accountant who had worked for 4 different syndicates over 15 years and who now worked, quietly and exclusively, for Evelina. The Moretti prefix in her phone was a cover classification, a misdirection she'd built into her contact system years ago, on the theory that if someone ever accessed her phone, they'd follow the wrong thread. Cassian didn't know this yet. He was still looking at the screen with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that keeps producing impossible answers. She didn't explain it. Not then. The call was 3 minutes and 40 seconds of clipped, precise exchange. Evelina asking questions, Ben answering in the compressed language of someone who understood that brevity was a professional obligation. When she ended it, she set the phone face down on the counter and looked at Cassian with something that was not an apology and not a concession, but was, possibly, the closest thing to an olive branch she was capable of producing. "The ledger is fabricated," she said. "The account structures are real, they're mine, but the framing is wrong. Someone took accurate information and recontextualized it to look like a control apparatus aimed at you. They needed you to see a threat." "So you'd run," Cassian said. "So you'd move against me before I could finish what I was building." She paused. "Or so I'd make a mistake, panic, reach out to people in ways that could be traced and used." Cassian was standing with his arms at his sides, which was a posture she recognized. It was what he looked like when he was holding himself very still because the alternative was motion, and motion without direction was dangerous. He was a man who needed to hit something and couldn't identify the target yet. "Who has access to your account structures?" he said. 3 people. Ben, a lawyer named Cass Wren who doesn't know whose account she's managing, and... She stopped. A flat, controlled stop, the kind that costs something. "And 1 other." "Who?" The pause was longer than it should have been, which told him the answer was going to be expensive. "My assistant," she said. "A woman named Petra Voss. She's been with me for 4 years. Cassian waited. "I trusted her with access to the second-tier structures 8 months ago," Evelina said, "because the volume of management had become... because I needed..." She stopped again. Shorter stop this time. She didn't do vulnerability well, and she knew it, and she wasn't going to dress it up. "I made an error in judgment." The sentence landed in the room like something dropped from a height. In 14 years of marriage, across everything, the wars, the investigations, the financial restructurings, the 14 months of Celine Cross, Cassian had never heard his wife admit to an error in judgment. He'd assumed she didn't make them. He understood now that she did, that she'd simply been managing them faster than they became visible, and that this one had moved too fast for her. "Where is she now?" he said. "That's what I need to find out." "Evelina." "Cassian." She looked at him directly. "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I had this coming. You're thinking this is what happens when you build things in the dark. Maybe you're right, but we don't have time for that conversation because whoever fabricated that ledger and fed it to you is already running the next move, and the next move is not about me." "Then what is it about?" "The summit," she said. He went still in a different way. The summit, the quarterly gathering of the 8 major family heads, a tradition that predated both of them, conducted at a rotating location under the nominal assumption of neutral ground, was scheduled for 11 days from now. "Someone wants all 8 families in one room," she said, "and they want them fractured before they get there." The logic assembled itself in the air between them, and it was ugly logic, the kind that made the stomach drop because it was too coherent to dismiss. Fracture the Viscari marriage. Pull the allied families sideways. Set Cassian moving against his own network, burning relationships he'd spent years maintaining. Send the major dons into the summit already doubting each other, already pulled by competing signals, already positioned by the chaos to be unable to coordinate a unified response to whatever was coming. "An attack," Cassian said, "or a takeover, or both." She moved off the counter stool. She was not a tall woman, but she moved in a way that occupied space deliberately, each step considered. 8 family heads, 1 location. Maximum chaos already seated. Whatever walks through the door during that summit, whoever shows up with enough force in the right moment, walks into a room that can't fight back as one unit. Cassian's jaw tightened. Moretti? Maybe. But the Moretti family doesn't have the resources to move on 8 families simultaneously. This is bigger. She picked up her phone again. And someone in my organization helped them plan it. She called a number. It rang once. A woman's voice answered, low, accented, guarded. Petra, Evelina said. Don't run. The line went silent for 3 seconds. Then the call disconnected. Evelina looked at the dead phone. Then she looked at Cassian. She's running, she said. Marco Vitelli got the call from Cassian at 9:47 in the morning. He was in the Viscari logistics office on the south end of the city, sitting across from a man named Toll, who ran the northeastern courier routes, and the conversation he'd been having with Toll had been producing information that sat in his chest like a stone. He stepped out to take Cassian's call. Find Petra Voss, Cassian said. She worked for Evelina. I need her location. Marco already knew the name. He'd heard it twice in the last 4 days, from 2 different sources, in contexts that had not seemed connected until this exact moment. He felt the pieces land. Give me an hour, he said. You have 30 minutes. The call ended. Marco went back inside, told Toll they were done, and made 3 calls in rapid succession. The 3rd call got him what he needed. A location, approximate, west side adjacent to the transit hub. He sent it to Cassian's secure line and then sat for a moment with his phone in his hand and the particular expression of a man who has been holding information at arm's length and can't do it anymore. He called a number he hadn't used in 6 weeks. It rang 4 times. A woman answered. She made contact with Cassian, Marco said. It's moving. A pause, then, how much does he know? Not everything, not yet, he exhaled. He's going to figure out the rest. You know that. Another pause. Longer. When the voice came back, it was quieter, more controlled, with an edge underneath the control, like something pressed against glass from the inside. Then we accelerate, Celine Cross said. Make sure the right people know Cassian is meeting with her, privately, without his security. Marco was silent. Marco. I heard you. Then, I said I heard you. His voice was flat. Final. Don't call me on this line again. He disconnected. He sat with the dead phone and the stone in his chest and 19 years of service to a family he had genuinely believed in. And he thought about the moment, 8 months ago, when Celine Cross had come to him with information about Evelina's financial structures and a proposition that had seemed, at the time, like the rational management of a situation that was getting complicated. He hadn't understood then what he was agreeing to help build. He understood now. The stone in his chest had weight and a name, and the name was Too Late. He picked up his phone and made one more call, a number he'd been holding for exactly this kind of moment, hoping he'd never need it. It rang once. I need to speak to Evelina Mero, he said. Petra Voss was not fundamentally a bad person. She was a person who had made a series of choices under financial pressure, each of which had seemed manageable at the time, each of which had tightened the rope a half-inch more, until the rope was around her throat, and the woman holding the other end was not someone she could have said no to even if she'd tried. She was 34, precise, organized, the kind of person who processed other people's complex problems with the emotional engagement of someone solving a crossword. She'd come to Evelina through a professional referral 4 years ago. She'd taken the job because the pay was exceptional and the work was interesting, and the woman she worked for was, by any observable metric, extraordinary. She'd been approached by Celine Cross's intermediary 14 months ago. The approach had been framed as simple information sharing, a few account details, nothing operational, nothing that would harm Evelina's physical safety. Just numbers, just structure. The payment was significant. Petra's mother was sick. The bills were significant in a different way. She told herself 11 months ago that it would stop after one exchange, then another, and then one morning she'd woken up understanding that she wasn't an employee who'd made a mistake. She was an asset, owned, And the information she'd been providing had built something that she couldn't look at directly, because looking at it directly meant acknowledging what she'd done. She was in a taxi heading toward the transit hub when Evelina's call came in. She heard the voice, "Don't run." And she ran anyway, because the alternative was standing still, and she couldn't make herself do it. She made it 4 blocks from the transit hub before the car pulled up alongside her. Not Cassian's car, a different vehicle, black, unfamiliar. The window came down. The man inside was not someone she recognized, but the way he held himself, the specific contained stillness of someone who did physical things for a living, was a language she understood. "Ms. Voss," he said, "someone wants to speak with you." It's not a request." She got in the car, not because she had a choice, because in the underworld's informal grammar, when someone sent a car and a man with that particular stillness, the absence of visible weapons was not the same as the absence of threat. The car took her to a building she didn't recognize. 3rd floor. A room with minimal furniture and a view of the river, which she registered distantly as familiar in some way she couldn't immediately place. She was placed in a chair. She waited. Celine Cross came in 10 minutes later. She was wearing a dark coat, no jewelry. She looked at Petra the way you look at something that has served its function and is now a liability. "You talked to her," Celine said. "She called me. I didn't." "She called you, and you ran, which means she knows enough to have called you, which means the window has changed." Celine sat down across from her. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing. The call was 5 seconds. Celine looked at her for a long time, reading something. Petra had worked for Evelina long enough to recognize what it looked like when someone was doing a rapid threat assessment behind neutral eyes. She'd seen Evelina do it 100 times. Seeing it in Celine Cross felt like looking at a photocopy of something. The shape was right, but the quality was off. "The ledger reached Cassian," Celine said. "He went to her." "I know, which means they're talking, which means—" She stopped. Something moved in her expression. "Which means I need to know exactly how much she knows about the summit." Petra's stomach dropped in a specific way, the way it dropped when the thing you'd been not looking at became impossible to avoid looking at. "The summit," she said carefully. "Don't do that. Don't play careful with me. You built the financial models for the secondary structures. You know what they're funding." Petra looked at her hands. She'd been telling herself for 14 months that she was only providing information, data, abstract numbers. She'd been telling herself she didn't know what the numbers were building. She'd known. She'd always known. "She doesn't know about the funding," Petra said. "She knows about the ledger. She knows someone fabricated it. I don't think she's connected it to the summit yet." "You don't think?" "I don't know." Celine stood. She walked to the window, outside the river. She looked at it with the expression of someone calculating distances. "We moved the timeline," she said. 7 days instead of 11. "That's not enough time." "It's enough." She turned around. "And you're staying here until it's done." The word here landed with a specific weight. Petra understood what it meant. She was not a guest. She was a variable that needed to be controlled for the next 7 days. She looked at the door. The man from the car was standing outside it. She looked back at Celine. "She's going to find me," Petra said. Celine's expression didn't change. "Let her try." Marco Vitelli found Evelina's number through a channel she hadn't given him, which meant he'd had it for a while and hadn't used it, which meant something about the timing of him using it now. She answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been expecting the call or something like it. "Marco," she said. "I need to see you," he said. "Not Cassian. You." A pause. She was processing. He could feel it across the line, the rapid calibration. "Why?" "Because I've been making mistakes for 8 months and I'm out of runway." His voice was flat, not self-pitying, self-accurate. "And because I know where Petra Voss is." The pause this time was shorter. "Where?" "I'll tell you in person. There are things I need to say that I won't say on a phone." Another pause, then, 2 hours. "I'll send you an address." "Not the West Side apartment. She knows that location." A beat of silence, then, "You've been watching her." "I've been watching all of it," he said, "for longer than I should have let it go on." He exhaled. A long breath, the kind that carries weight. 2 hours. Send me somewhere new. She sent him an address 40 minutes later. A restaurant on the North End, Italian, the kind of place that had private rooms in the back for conversations that needed walls. He drove there alone, without telling Cassian, without telling anyone in the organization. For the first time in 19 years, Marco Vitelli operated completely outside the Vescari chain of command, and the feeling was not liberation. It was the specific gravity of a man who has finally put down something heavy and discovered that his hands are shaking. She was already there when he arrived, seated in the back room, coffee in front of her, alone. No security. He'd half expected Cassian or someone. The fact that she'd come alone told him something about her read of the situation. She'd understood from his voice that what he was bringing her was not a threat. He sat down. He didn't take off his coat. "Celine Cross," he said. "She came to me 8 months ago with information about your financial structures. Said she needed to understand the architecture to protect Cassian's interests. He stopped. His hands were flat on the table. "I told myself it was routine, oversight, the kind of thing that was my job to facilitate." Evelina was watching him. Her face was unreadable in the specific way of someone who is reading a great deal. "What did you give her?" she said. "Account structures. Holding company trees. Nothing operational, nothing that touched personnel." He met her eyes. "I told myself it wasn't enough to do real damage. It was enough to build a ledger." "Yes." She didn't raise her voice, she didn't look away. She held his gaze with the steady, pressurized attention of someone who is deciding how to weigh something. "Why are you here, Marco?" "Because she's moved Petra Voss. She has her somewhere on the west side. I have an approximate address. And because she's moved the summit timeline." He leaned forward. 7 days. The stillness in Evelina's face sharpened into something else, something operational. "How do you know?" "Because I'm still in her network. She doesn't know I'm here." He paused. "She won't know for maybe 6 hours. After that, 6 hours is enough," Evelina said. She was already reaching for her phone. "I need the address." "Evelina." He said her name the way you say a name when you need to be heard. She stopped, looked at him. "What she's planning for the summit. It's not a power move, it's not a takeover." His jaw was tight. "She's got outside funding, military grade, the kind of operation that doesn't leave witnesses." The room was very quiet. "She's not trying to control the families," Marco said. "She's trying to eliminate them. Every family, every head, one night, one location, clean." Evelina set her phone down. She looked at Marco with those dark eyes that didn't panic, but were working very fast behind their stillness, processing the shape of it, mapping the implications, finding the edges of what it meant. "Who's funding her?" she said. "I don't know. I only know the scale." He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket, set it on the table, slid it toward her. "I copied what I could before I came here." She unfolded it, looked at it. Her face didn't change, but her right hand, flat on the table beside the document, pressed down slightly. A small, involuntary pressure, the body registering something the face was refusing to show. "This is enough to move," she said. "It's enough to start. It's not enough to stop it alone." He looked at her. "You need Cassian." She was quiet. "I know what the last 14 months have been," Marco said. "I'm not asking you to forgive anything. I'm asking you to... I know what you're asking." Her voice was even, clean. "The families. All 8 heads in one room 7 days from now, with whatever she's hired already positioned." She looked at the document again. "She planned this for over a year. She needed the fracture between Cassian and me to happen now, at this specific moment, to make sure we couldn't coordinate a response in time." "Yes." "Which means she underestimated how fast we can move when we're not fighting each other." Marco looked at her for a moment. "Can you move that fast with him right now?" She folded the document, slid it into her inside jacket pocket, stood up. Send me the address for Petra, she said. Evelina, send me the address, Marco, then go to Cassian. She pulled on her coat. Tell him everything you told me. Don't soften it, don't edit it, all of it. He's going to be furious, she said. Let him be, it's useful. She looked at Marco one last time, and in the look was something that was not forgiveness and was not condemnation. It was something more pragmatic, the recognition of a man who had made a bad choice and was in the process of making a better one, and the acknowledgement that the better choice was the one that mattered now. Go. She walked out. Marco sat alone in the back room of a restaurant on the north end of the city, with cold coffee in front of him and the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a weight for 8 months and has finally put it down in the right place, even if the right place was also the most painful one. He picked up his phone. He called Cassian. Cassian took the call in his car, parked outside Evelina's building, having spent 40 minutes trying to reach Petra Voss's last known location through his own channels and coming up empty. He listened to Marco without interrupting, which was unusual. Cassian interrupted. It was part of how he processed. The interruption was a kind of comprehension, a punctuation that meant I understand, go on. The absence of interruption meant something else. It meant he was very still in a place that was not comfortable stillness. When Marco finished, the silence on the line lasted almost 10 seconds. You've been feeding her information for 8 months, Cassian said. Yes. About Evelina's structures? Yes. While working for me? Yes. Another silence. Outside the car, the city. A woman walking a dog. A delivery truck idling. The ordinary texture of a morning that had nothing to do with this conversation. Where are you now? Cassian said. North End. I'm coming to you. Don't. The word came out flat. Not a spike, flat, which was its own register of danger. Don't come to me. Not yet. A pause. Go to the Aldermere house. Wait in the study. Don't talk to anyone. Cassian. Marco. A pause. Something moved in the flatness of his voice. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Not even close to yet. Go to the study and wait. The call ended. Cassian sat in his car. He was breathing slowly and deliberately, the breathing of a man who has learned that the space between feeling something and acting on it is where most fatal mistakes get made. 19 years. Marco had given him 19 years of genuine service. Cassian knew that, could feel the weight of it, could not simply discount it. But he also knew what it felt like to be moving through a game and only now understanding how many of the pieces on the board were not where he'd believed them to be. First Evelina's hidden architecture, then the ledger. Now Marco. The board kept revising itself, and each revision was worse than the last. His phone rang. Evelina's number. I know where Petra is, she said when he answered. I'm going there. Alone. I'll take 2 people. You don't have 2 people. You haven't had security since you left the house. A pause. I have people. He absorbed this. She had people. Of course she had people. She'd had a rented apartment with a 3-year-old lease. She'd had a forensic accountant on a private line. She'd had saved contact numbers and modified phones and financial structures he hadn't known existed. Of course she had people. I'm coming with you, he said. That's not Evelina. His voice had an edge now, but it was not the edge of anger. It was something rougher and more honest. Whoever is in that building knows my organization has been compromised. My people are uncertain. Your assistant turned. Marco. He stopped. If you go in with just 2 of your people and something goes wrong, there's no one who can bring enough force to fix it in time. He paused. I'm coming with you. The line was quiet. I have a team, he said. 4 men I trust, completely. 4 men you trust, she said, and there was something in her voice, not mockery, not quite, but the particular tone of a woman who has been thinking about trust with precision for a very long time and finds the concept somewhat compressed. I know, he said. I know what that sounds like right now. Come with it anyway. A longer pause, the longest pause she'd given him since he'd walked into that apartment. 1 hour, she said. I'll send you the location. She sent it 12 minutes later. He read the address. He recognized the block, West Side, close to the transit hub, a building that the Viscari family had quietly used as a secondary location 3 years ago before a security review had flagged it, and it had been decommissioned. Someone had taken a location that was in old Viscari files, in records that would have been available to anyone with access to the family's historical property documentation, and repurposed it, which meant the operation against them was built partly from information that came from inside his organization, inside her organization. The architecture of Betrayal was layered, and somewhere in the building at that address, the woman who'd helped construct it was either a prisoner or a willing participant, and either way she held information that they needed before they could stop what was already in motion. Cassian called his 4 men, gave them the address, told them to come ready. He didn't use his regular security chief. He chose 4 men from middle ranks, men whose loyalty he could trace directly, whose histories he knew clean. He picked them in under 3 minutes, which meant he'd been maintaining that kind of mental inventory even when he hadn't thought he needed it, which meant some part of him had known, longer than he'd admitted, that the ground he was standing on was not as solid as he'd been treating it. He drove. The address was 22 minutes from where he sat. He made it in 16. He parked a block away. He checked his weapon. He sat and breathed and let the arithmetic of the situation assemble itself with as much clarity as he could manage. Somewhere in that building was a woman who had given his wife's secrets to a person who was, in some configuration he didn't yet fully understand, planning to put 8 family heads in a room and eliminate every one of them. His own name would presumably be on that list. Evelina's possibly too. The scale of what was coming was so far beyond the personal fractures of the last 14 months that it made those fractures look small, which was, he understood, exactly how it had been designed. Keep the king fighting his queen. Keep them from seeing the board. He saw the board now, badly late, but clearly. His phone showed Evelina's location moving toward the building from the other side, a block away. Closing. He got out of the car. He told his 4 men to hold position outside until he gave the signal. He crossed the street. The building's lobby door was unlocked, which was either an invitation or a setup, and he walked through it with the understanding that it might be both. He took the stairs. 3rd floor. The corridor was empty. A single door at the end of the hall showed a thin line of light underneath it. He heard voices behind the door. 2 of them. One he didn't recognize, worry. One he did. He put his hand on the door handle. Behind him, the stairwell door opened and Evelina came through it, her 2 people flanking her, her eyes finding him immediately. She took in the scene, his hand on the door, the light under it, the voices. In under a second, she moved to stand beside him. Together, she said quietly. Not a question. He looked at her. Something in his face that was not apology and was not resolution, but was possibly the first honest thing he'd shown her in a very long time. He pushed the door open. Petra Voss was seated in a chair, the man from the car standing behind her. Celine Cross was at the window, phone in hand, mid-sentence to whoever she was calling, and she turned at the sound of the door and her face went through something that moved too fast to fully name. Surprise, calculation, recovery, and underneath all of it, for just a fraction of a second, something that looked like fear. Not of Cassian. Of Evelina. She lowered the phone. She looked at them both, together, side by side, in the same room, moving toward her. And the calculation behind her eyes ran its equation and came up with an answer she didn't like, and the phone in her hand moved and Cassian saw it and said her name like a warning. But Celine Cross was already pressing send on the message she'd been composing, and in buildings across the city, 7 different phones received a 2-word text that none of them had wanted to receive ahead of schedule. Move now. And somewhere in the city, 7 days early, the machinery she'd built began to turn. The message left Celine's phone in under a second, and there was nothing to do about it. Cassian understood that immediately, the way you understand a gun has fired before the sound fully reaches you. The send was done. Whatever move now meant in the operational language of what she'd built, it was already in motion, already cascading through 7 phones in 7 locations across a city that had no idea what was coming. He crossed the room in 4 steps and took the phone out of her hand. Not violently. The absence of violence was its own statement. It said he was past the part where breaking things helped. He looked at the screen. Encrypted messaging app, the message delivered, no way to unsend it, no way to reach the recipients through this device because the contacts were listed as single-letter codes, and the app would require biometric authentication he didn't have. He looked at Celine. "Who did you send that to?" he said. She looked back at him. Her face had done something in the last 30 seconds. It had settled into a particular arrangement that he recognized as the expression of someone who has decided that the game is over and is now calculating what the post-game looks like. Not panic. Celine Cross didn't panic. She adapted. He'd found that quality compelling once. Right now it made him want to put his fist through the wall. "You can't stop it," she said. "The timeline moved. The pieces are already placed." "Who are the pieces?" "Independent contractors. 11 teams. Different points of entry. They don't know each other, they don't communicate laterally, and they won't stop because one phone went dark." She looked at him with something that was almost clinical. "That's how you build something that can't be decapitated. You learned that." I paid attention. Evelina was standing 2 feet to Cassian's left. She hadn't moved toward Celine. She was looking at Petra Voss, who was sitting in the chair with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the floor, and the specific posture of someone who has been waiting for a very particular kind of consequence and has finally run out of waiting. 11 teams, Evelina said. Not to Celine, to the room, to herself, running the arithmetic. 7 days early, no coordination between cells. She looked at Cassian. The summit location. She knows it, he said. Does she? Evelina looked at Celine. How? Celine's expression shifted slightly, a micro-movement at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile and was not quite contempt. The summit location was communicated through Vescari channels 3 weeks ago. Cassian's communication director, a man named Trent Oswald, sent the confirmation to 6 family liaisons through the standard encrypted relay. She paused. Trent Oswald has been on my payroll for 5 months. The name landed. Cassian's jaw tightened. Trent Oswald, 38, meticulous, had handled Vescari external communications for 7 years. Cassian ran back through everything Oswald had touched in 5 months, and the list was long and the damage potential was significant, and there was no time to map it fully right now. What's the target location? Cassian said. You already know the location. The Hargrove Estate, Westchester. She folded her hands in front of her. 11 entry teams. 4 external, 7 positioned inside the estate's service infrastructure. It took 8 months to place them. A pause. You can't extract all of them in 7 days. You definitely can't in whatever time you have now. Cassian looked at her for a long time. Then he turned to his man who was standing by the door and said a name. Quiet, precise. And the man moved to take physical control of Celine, not roughly but definitively, moving her away from the window and into the chair beside Petra. He turned to Evelina. The families, he said. We need to warn them. We warn them, and the summit collapses, she said. 8 family heads scatter. Whatever Celine has built, it's designed for one specific location. If the families scatter, the threat doesn't go away. It fragments. 11 independent teams with no lateral communication, operating on a dead signal from their controller. She looked at Celine. What happens to them if you can't reach them? Celine said nothing. They complete the objective, Evelina said. Or they abort and disperse, and we spend the next 2 years finding them one at a time while they find other buyers. She looked at Cassian. We can't let our teams disperse. We need them in one place. Cassian understood where she was going and didn't like it. The summit, but on our terms. She turned to Petra. Petra. Petra looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She had the look of someone who had been processing guilt in real time for a long time and had arrived, through that processing, at a place that was past fear and into something more exhausted. She looked at Evelina the way you look at a person you've wronged badly when you finally run out of the energy to keep not looking. The service infrastructure, Evelina said. You built the financial models for the secondary structures. That means you saw the operational budgets. What were they funding inside the Hargrove estate? A pause. Long enough that Cassian moved 1 step toward the chair, and the step alone, so not a threat, just a presence, was enough. Catering and maintenance contracts, Petra said. Her voice was low and cracked slightly at the edges. Replaced the estate's existing vendors 8 months ago. The new vendors are the shell companies. The teams are embedded in the service staff. She stopped, swallowed. There are also 2 external positions, elevated, northwest and southeast corners of the property perimeter. Snipers, Cassian said. I don't know what they are. The budget line said perimeter security, but the cost... She stopped again. The cost said something else, Evelina said. Petra nodded. Evelina straightened. She was doing the thing Cassian had watched her do for 14 years, the thing he'd registered without fully appreciating, the rapid internal construction of a response architecture, the building of a structure out of available materials at speed. He could almost see the framework going up. We need to be in that estate before the teams activate, she said, not to cancel the summit, to control it. Control it how? Cassian said. By knowing exactly where every piece is before the board moves. She looked at Petra. Can you rebuild the operational map from the financial models? Locations? Timing? What's embedded where? Petra hesitated. Then, yes, given access to my files. 2 hours, maybe 3. You have one. Evelina looked at Cassian. I need to make calls, 7 calls. A pause. To the families. Not to warn them off. To read them in. All of it. What Celine built, what I built, the summit, the teams. She held his gaze. If they're going to walk into that room, they deserve to walk in knowing what the room is. And if they choose to come, I need them coordinated. He looked at her. That means telling them about your network. Yes. About everything you've been doing for 8 years. Yes. They're going to have questions. They're going to have a lot of questions, she said, and I'm going to answer them, because the alternative is 8 family heads going to Westchester in 6 days, thinking it's a routine summit and dying in a building that's been wired against them for 8 months. Her voice was even, flat, the voice of someone who has made a decision that costs something and has finished the process of making it. Make your calls, I'll make mine. She looked at her watch. We have less time than either of us wants. Cassian turned to his man at the door. Take her downstairs, keep her contained, don't hurt her. He meant Celine. He didn't look at her when he said it. Then he took out his phone and began to make calls. The first call Evelina made was to Aurelius Crane in Chicago. She told him everything. It took 11 minutes, and she didn't soften a single piece of it. Crane listened without interrupting, which was unusual for a man who processed information combatively. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough to mean something. The architect, Crane said finally. That's you. That's always been me. Another silence. And Cassian, he knows all of this. He's learning it in real time, same as you. How do I know, Crane said carefully, that this isn't the play? You and Cassian, together, manufacturing a crisis to consolidate the families under your roof. You don't, she said. You make a judgment call based on everything you know about me, every interaction we've had in 8 years, and you decide. A pause. Aurelius, your son was in federal custody in 2020, and he came out clean. Did you ever ask how? A long pause. I suspected. Now you know. She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Come to the summit. Come in knowing what I've told you. Bring your best people and tell them what to look for. If I'm lying, if any of this is manufactured, you'll know it within the first hour, and you can burn me down yourself. The silence after that was different, working. She could hear Crane doing the same thing she did, building a framework out of available materials, assessing the weight of each piece. I'll be there, he said. She moved to the next call. By the third call, Remy Delacroix, New Orleans, a pattern had established itself that she hadn't fully anticipated. Each family head, when presented with the complete picture, with the revelation of 8 years of quiet intervention, did not respond with the outrage or the territorial suspicion she'd prepared for. They responded with something closer to recognition, the click of a thing that had been confusing becoming coherent, the financial bridge that had appeared from nowhere in 2019, the federal interests that had quietly redirected in 2021, the courier routes that had, inexplicably, stayed clean through a period of intense surveillance. They'd all known, at some level, that there was a hand in their operations that they hadn't placed. They'd attributed it to luck, or to the natural functioning of a network that was healthy enough to self-correct. They hadn't looked for the hand because the hand had never asked for anything. Until now. Remy Delacroix, 32 years old and running a family he'd inherited under impossible circumstances and had managed against every reasonable expectation, listened to her for 9 minutes and then said, "Whatever you need from me." She told him what she needed, specifically. He wrote it down. The fourth call was to a man named Benedict Solari, the oldest active Don in the network, 71, running the Solari family out of Miami. A man who had known Cassian's father and who was the closest thing the underworld had to institutional memory. She'd been saving him for the fourth call deliberately, because what she needed from Solari was not operational support. What she needed from Solari was something that had been sitting in a document for over a decade, something she had known about for 3 years but had never used because she'd hoped she would never need to. Solari answered on the second ring. He had a voice like gravel turning slowly. "Evelina." "Benedict." She paused. "The document." A long silence. "It's time," she said. Another silence. Longer. She could hear him breathing on the other end, the slow, deliberate breathing of a man who is 71 and has learned that most urgencies are less urgent than they feel, and who is now determining whether this one is the exception. "He doesn't know," Solari said. "No. When he finds out, he'll deal with it," she said, "the same way he deals with everything, by taking time to process and then doing what needs to be done." She paused. "He's been doing that since he was 15 years old. It's the best thing about him." Solari was quiet. Then he said, "I'll bring it." She ended the call and sat for a moment with the phone in her hands and the weight of what she'd just set in motion. The document Solari was bringing to the summit was something that would change the fundamental structure of the Viscari Empire. Change it in ways that even she, who had been building toward this in oblique ways for years, felt the gravity of. She'd known about it for 3 years since Solari had shown it to her in confidence at a meeting that Cassian hadn't attended. She'd processed it and filed it in the place where she kept the things that could not be used until the right moment. She'd never told Cassian. Not because she wanted to deceive him, but because the right moment had never arrived, and she'd understood, with the precision of long experience, that that kind of truth, delivered at the wrong time, destroys more than it illuminates. The right moment was now. Whether she was ready for what it would do to the room and to Cassian was a different question. She went back inside. Petra was working at a table, 3 laptops open, files pulled from a cloud storage she'd accessed through a personal login that Seleni's people had apparently not known existed. Her hands were steady, the steadiness of guilt converted into purpose, the specific focus of someone who has decided that the only available form of repentance is accuracy. Cassian was standing by the window where Selene had stood an hour ago. He was on his phone, but the call had ended and he was looking at the screen with an expression she recognized, the post-call face, the moment of absorbing what you've just committed to. 4 of the 8 are confirmed, he said when she came in. The other 3 I'm waiting on callbacks. I've spoken to Crane, Delacroix, Solari, and the Vance family. All 4 are in. She set her phone on the table. We need to talk about the estate. I'm having my people contact the Hargrove Security Management. We can't tip the estate management, she said. If any of Celine's embedded teams have a contact in security, we announce our knowledge and the whole thing collapses. The teams disperse. She looked at him. We go in as if the summit is routine. We go in knowing where they are. We let them think they still have the element of surprise. Cassian looked at her. We walk in knowing there are 11 armed teams in the building. 11 teams that we've now mapped, she said. Petra's rebuilt 60% of the operational layout. By tonight, we'll have all of it. And then we go to the summit. All 8 families, coordinated, with pre-positioned responses that the teams won't see coming because they'll be looking at a room that looks exactly like what they expected. She paused. We turn her trap into ours. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't resistance, but was the processing of something large. If we're wrong about any of the positions, if one of the teams is somewhere Petra doesn't know, We might be wrong, she said. I'm not going to tell you this is certain. Nothing in the next 6 days is certain. She held his gaze. But 11 dispersed teams with a dead controller are more dangerous long-term than 11 teams in one location that we've mapped. And 8 family heads who know what's coming are harder to kill than 8 family heads who don't. The estate staff, he said. The real ones. Legitimate employees. She'd been thinking about this. She could see he had too. We get them out, she said, quietly. A staged kitchen emergency, a catering personnel change, something that reads as routine logistics, 48 hours before the summit. She looked at Petra. Can you pull the staffing schedule? Petra pulled up a file without looking up. Already found it. Cassian walked to the table. He looked at Petra's screens, the operational map taking shape, the embedded team positions marked in red against a floor plan of the Hargrove estate, the service corridors and kitchen access points and perimeter positions. He looked at it for a long time. There, he said, pointing to a position on the northeast corner of the floor plan. That's not on Petra's list. Evelina looked. He was right. The northeast corner of the estate's main hall had no red marker, but the service access pattern around it was wrong. The corridor traffic was heavier than the function of that space required. Petra, Evelina said. Petra looked at the map. Something moved in her face. That wasn't in the budgets I saw. She leaned closer. But the service contract for the Northeast Mechanical Room was under a different holding company, a separate LLC. I didn't have access to its financials. Separate LLC, Cassian said, meaning a separate funder. A beat. The room absorbed this. Cellini had a second source, Evelina said. Not a question. The logic of it assembled itself immediately. A woman who built things in compartments, who had designed her operation so that no single person had the complete picture, would of course have a funding source she hadn't exposed to the people she was using. A backup. A primary. Something that existed in a layer below the layer Petra had accessed. Bring her up, Cassian said. His man at the door went downstairs. 2 minutes later, Celine was in the room. She looked at the floor plan on Petra's screen and her face did the thing it had done in the moment they'd walked through the door. The rapid recalculation, the reassessment of what was visible versus what she'd intended to keep covered. Northeast Mechanical, Cassian said. Different funder. Who? Celine looked at the screen. Then she looked at Cassian. Then, and this was the thing that shifted the temperature of the entire room, she looked at Evelina. Not at Cassian, at Evelina. And the look on her face was not the adapted, recovered look of a woman managing an unfavorable situation. It was something older than that, something that looked, for the first time, like it was real. You should sit down, Celine said. To Evelina. Tell me who, Evelina said. The Northeast Mechanical Room is funded through a holding company called Varro Capital. Varro Capital was incorporated in Delaware 9 years ago. She paused. The registered agent is a man named Douglas Fine. That's the name he used. But the biometric signature on the incorporation documents... She stopped. She was watching Evelina's face with an expression that had gone from calculation to something closer to apprehension. The biometric signature matches a federal identity profile under another name. The room was very quiet. What name? Evelina said. Cross-matched against FBI records, the identity profile belongs to a man named Victor Marrow. Celine held her gaze. Your father, Evelina. Except your father didn't die when you were 17. He went into witness protection, and he came out 4 years ago. The silence that followed was not a normal silence. It was the specific silence of a room in which something fundamental has been broken and everyone present can hear it breaking, but nobody is moving yet because the shape of the break isn't fully visible. Evelina did not move. She did not make a sound. Her face was utterly still. Not the managed, operational stillness she wore as armor, but a different kind. The stillness of a person who has just taken a blow to a place they hadn't known was unprotected. Cassian looked at her. He'd seen his wife manage everything, witnessed her hold composure through things that would have unmade most people. He had never seen her look like this. That's not, she started. Faro Capital's financial records go back 9 years, Celine said. Her voice had changed. It was quieter. Not softer. Celine Cross didn't do soft. But there was something in it that was closer to truth than anything she'd said in the past hour. He's been watching your network, Evelina. He's been watching you build it. He placed people in positions before you placed them. He knew about the summit contact list before Petra did. She paused. He's not a funder. He's an architect, a different one. And he's been using your structure as a blueprint. Evelina's breathing was visible now. A slight controlled elevation. The only thing showing. Why? She said. The word came out stripped down, raw. The single syllable of someone who has bypassed the entire middle layer of response and gone straight to the question that was going to cost the most. I don't know his full motivation, Celine said. I was approached by his intermediary 14 months ago, offered resources, operational intelligence, cover, in exchange for running the surface operation, the visible play against you and Cassian, while he ran the deeper one. She looked at the floor plan. I was the distraction. You've been investigating me for an hour. That's an hour you haven't spent on the Northeast mechanical room. She looked up. Which is where his people are, and they're not contractors. They're not organized crime. They're federal assets, privatized, working off book. Cassian said something low and forceful that was not a word. He moved to the window. He stood there with his back to the room and his hands at his sides, and the very particular posture of a man who is reassessing something at a structural level. Federal assets, off book. A man who had faked his death when Evelina was 17, gone into witness protection, emerged 4 years ago, and spent those 4 years building a mirror of his daughter's network while she built hers, using Celine as the visible threat, using the underworld's attention on the Viscari fracture to cover a deeper operation in the same building on the same night, with resources that 11 organized crime teams couldn't match. The summit was not just a target. It was a final play in a longer game that none of them had been watching because none of them had known to watch it. Evelina turned to the window, not to look at Cassian, to look at the river, which was still moving outside in its permanent, indifferent way. How do I know, she said quietly, that you're not running a play right now, that this isn't another layer of misdirection? You don't, Celine said. The same way I told you. You make a call based on what you know and what you can verify. A pause. Check the Delaware Incorporation records for Varo Capital. The biometric data is in the public filing. Your forensic accountant can pull it in 20 minutes. Evelina was quiet for 5 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called Fenn. She gave him the information in 12 words. She told him 20 minutes. She ended the call. Then she stood with the phone in her hand and the river outside the window and the weight of a father who had not died when she was 17, but had instead built a life in parallel and had never contacted her, and had watched her construct her entire network, and had used it as a blueprint for something she didn't yet fully understand. And she felt the floor of the situation tilt in a way that was different from all the other tiltings of the past week, because this one touched something that was not professional, not operational, not strategic. This one touched the 17-year-old who had stood at a grave and decided, in the absence of everything, that she was going to be the kind of person who built things instead of waiting for things to collapse. Cassian turned from the window. He came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would make the shape of it smaller, and he understood that about her. Had always understood it, was perhaps one of the few people who did. And so he simply stood there, the way you stand next to someone when the ground has dropped away and the only available thing is presence. Fenn called back in 18 minutes. It's real, he said. The biometric signature matches a federally protected identity. The name on the protected record is redacted, but the corporate footprint is consistent with a 9-year operation. Whoever this is, they've been building for a long time. She thanked him. She ended the call. She looked at Cassian. He's going to be at the summit, she said, not as a target, as a participant, embedded in the Northeast mechanical room with federal-grade resources and a plan that's been running 9 years and that we don't fully understand yet. She paused. And in 6 days, every major crime family in the country is going to walk into that room. What do we do? Cassian said. She looked at the floor plan, at the northeast corner. at the red markers of Celine's teams and the unmarked space where a different kind of threat was sitting in a room that even Petra hadn't known about. "We go," she said. "We go and we deal with Celine's teams the way we planned, and we find him." A pause that cost her something. "I find him." Cassian looked at her. "He's your father." "He was," she said. "Now he's an unknown variable in a room full of people I've spent 8 years keeping alive." She picked up her phone. Her hand was steady. The steadiness cost her something too, but the cost was internal, invisible, paid in a currency that didn't show on the surface. That's what he is now. She made the next call, and the next. And the city moved outside and the river moved outside, and 6 days stretched ahead like a corridor with no visible end. And somewhere in a building in Westchester, a man who had not died sat in a room and waited, and whether he was waiting for his daughter or for the empire she'd built or for something that had no name yet was the question that was going to define everything that came next. And the answer was still 5 days away, and one revelation away, and one room away. And the door to that room was already visible on the floor plan on Petra's screen, marked only as NE-MECH. And every time Evelina's eyes crossed the floor plan in the next 6 days, they would find that corner and stay there for exactly 1 second before moving on, because 1 second was all she would allow herself. For now. The 6 days moved the way time moves when everything inside it is being built simultaneously, too fast and too slow at once, the hours compressing in the work and stretching in the intervals when the work stopped and the thinking started and the thinking went to places that were not useful. Evelina slept 4 hours a night. She knew because she counted. She'd always been a counter. Hours, variables, probabilities, the weight of each piece in a structure she was assembling at speed. She counted the hours the way you track something finite when everything around it feels uncontrolled. 4 hours. She could function on 4 hours. She'd done it before. Petra finished the operational map on the second day. 11 teams, 43 individuals across Celine's network, positioned in service corridors, kitchen access points, 2 exterior perimeter locations, and 3 interior staging areas. The map was meticulous. Petra had built it from financial models the way an archaeologist rebuilds a structure from fragments, inferring, cross-referencing, testing each inference against the budget logic until the thing cohered. It was, by any professional measure, excellent work. Evelina looked at it for a long time and said, "Good." 1 word. It was the most she could give, and Petra understood that it was not a small word from this woman, and accepted it. The northeast mechanical room remained unmarked. They had the location. They had Celine's confirmation. What they didn't have was the interior layout, the personnel count, or any reliable intelligence on what Victor Marrow, the man who had not died, the man who had watched from a distance for 26 years, the man who had built a mirror of his daughter's network without ever picking up a phone to tell her he was alive, was actually planning to do when the room filled. Evelina did not speak about him outside of operational context. She mentioned the northeast mechanical room in briefings the way she mentioned any other tactical element, flat, precise, without inflection. Cassian watched her do this and said nothing because there was nothing to say that would be useful, and he'd started in the last 6 days to understand more clearly the difference between what was useful and what was true, and to apply that understanding with more discipline than he'd managed in the previous 14 months. On the 4th day, Marco came to the estate pre-positioning meeting. He walked into the room and sat down without waiting to be invited and opened a folder and put 4 photographs on the table and said, "Trent Oswald is at a hotel in Midtown. I have him under observation. He hasn't made contact with anyone in 48 hours, which means Celine's network has gone dark for him too." He paused. "He's scared." Evelina looked at the photographs. "Keep him there. Don't approach him yet. He might run. He won't. He's scared, which means he's staying close to something familiar. Hotels are familiar." She looked up. "We'll need him after. He has 6 months of internal communications." Marco nodded. He didn't look at Cassian. Cassian didn't look at him. The space between them was functional and cold, and they were both operating inside it with the focused efficiency of men who understood that the work was the only available common ground, and they would work on the other thing when the work was done. Maybe. The estate itself was a problem that required delicacy. The Hargrove estate in Westchester, 40 acres, stone and brick main house, service wings on the east and west flanks, formal grounds that had been used for the quarterly summit for 9 consecutive years, was not under Viscari control. It was managed by a neutral party, a concierge service that handled high-security private events and asked no questions about who the guests were, which was the entire point. Approaching the management directly was still off the table. Approaching the estate staff was off the table. What Evelina did instead was have Fenn trace the employment histories of the service contractor employees, the ones Celine's shell companies had placed, and establish their approximate entry points and shift rotations from payroll records she accessed through a financial back channel. It wasn't complete. She knew it wasn't complete. She built contingency around the gaps and told the family heads what the gaps were, because she'd decided, in one of the 4-hour nights, lying in the dark in the West Side apartment, the river outside and the city around her and the weight of a living father somewhere in the structure she was walking toward, that the single most important thing she could give the 8 families was the truth, unfiltered, including the parts that were uncertain, including the parts that reflected badly on her. She told them about Petra. She told them about Marco's role in the ledger construction. She told them about Trent Oswald. She told them about the Northeast Mechanical Room and the man in it and what she knew and what she didn't. All of it, in every call, one by one. The response across all 7 conversations was the same, not unanimous enthusiasm, not blind trust. What she got was the specific response of people who have been told a hard truth delivered without spin, which is the response of people who are recalibrating, reweighing everything they thought they knew against this new information and finding that the reweighing, while uncomfortable, produces a more accurate picture than the one they'd been carrying. Aurelius Crane called her on the 5th day, unprompted. "The woman who told us the truth about what she didn't know," he said, "is the one I'm betting on." She thanked him and ended the call and sat with that for exactly the amount of time she allowed herself to sit with things that weren't operational, which was not very long. The night before the summit, she didn't sleep at all. Guess. The Hargrove estate on the morning of the summit was exactly what it always was. Stone and brick in November light, the long gravel drive raked smooth, staff moving with the practiced efficiency of people who handled events like this regularly and had learned not to register the faces of the guests. Black cars pulling through the iron gates in intervals. Security details peeling off to designated holding positions. The particular controlled atmosphere of a gathering of people who are simultaneously performing normalcy and scanning every room they enter. Evelina arrived in the 4th car. She wore dark charcoal, not a color she usually chose, but the morning had made it seem right, the gray November light outside making color feel like a claim she wasn't ready to stake. She walked through the main entrance beside Cassian, which was itself a statement. They had not been photographed together since Obsidian, and every pair of eyes in the room registered it and processed it and filed it. She felt their eyes. She always felt them. She moved through it. The main hall of the Hargrove estate was a large rectangular room with high ceilings, chandeliers that were either antique or very good reproductions, long windows that looked out onto the formal grounds. 8 round tables had been arranged in a loose configuration, each with a small arrangement of neutral flowers, each with the family's assigned position in the room's geography. It was a setup that had been used for 9 years. Familiar. Calibrated for a kind of routine they were now completely abandoning. Evelina made eye contact with Crane first, who was already seated and nursing coffee and looking at her with an expression she read as, "I'm here, I'm ready, I hope you're right." She gave him a minimal nod. She moved through the room and touched elbows and exchanged the clipped pleasantries of people who were communicating in a register beneath their words, and the register beneath the words was, "The map is in your secure phone. Your people know their positions. When it starts, you will know." Cassian worked the other side of the room. She watched him peripherally, the way he moved, the contained, deliberate quality of it, the hands that were always slightly too still. He was doing the thing he was actually good at, which was occupying a room as if he owned it, which was useful right now because the service staff needed to see business as usual, and Cassian Vescari walking into a room he'd been coming to for 9 years and looking like he owned it was the most normal thing in the world. She found Remy Delacroix at the east window, looking out at the grounds with the thoughtful expression of someone calculating sight lines. He was good. He'd absorbed the briefing and translated it into the right kind of operational awareness without letting it show in his posture. 32 years old, and better at this than men twice his age. "Northeast corner," he said quietly, not turning from the window. "Yes," she said. "How many?" "Unknown." He nodded once. He kept looking out the window. She moved on. Benedict Solari came in at 9:45, the last to arrive, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man of 71 who has learned that pace is a choice and not a limitation. He caught her eye across the room. He had a leather briefcase. He set it on his designated table and sat down and folded his hands on top of it and waited. She looked at the briefcase. The document inside it was the thing she'd set in motion with that phone call 6 days ago, and had spent the intervening time not thinking about directly, the way you don't look directly at something very bright because you need to still be able to see when the moment comes to look. She went to her seat. She sat. The room filled the rest of the way. Staff moved with coffee and water, the ordinary texture of a summit morning, and Evelina watched the staff and placed each face against Petra's map, and most of them matched, and 3 of them didn't. 3 faces that weren't on Petra's staffing list, moving correctly, serving correctly, doing nothing that would register to anyone who hadn't spent 6 days memorizing the map. But wrong. She touched the secure phone in her jacket pocket twice. The signals she'd pre-established with Cassian's 4 trusted men, who were positioned in adjacent rooms with 3 of the family heads' security details, pre-briefed, pre-coordinated. 2 touches. "We have visual confirmation. Targets identified." Cassian, across the room, adjusted his cuff. The return signal, received. The summit opened the way it always opened, with a statement from the most senior family head present, which was Solari. And Solari rose with his briefcase and his 71 years and his gravel voice and said, "Before we begin the scheduled business, there's a matter of foundational importance that I've been asked to raise." He looked around the room with the unhurried attention of someone who has been in rooms like this for 50 years and is no longer required to perform urgency. "Some of you know pieces of it. None of you know all of it. I'm going to fix that." He opened the briefcase. He removed a document, sealed, stamped, the physical weight of something official and irreversible. He placed it on the table in front of him. "This is a document executed by the late Emilio Vescari," he said, "Cassian's father, 12 years ago, 2 years before his death. It designates in explicit and legally binding terms under the compact governing these families a successor guardian for the Vescari Empire, and by the authority the Vescari family held at that time for the broader governance structure of this council." The room was very still. Cassian was completely motionless. "The designee," Solari said, "is Evelina Marrow." The stillness changed quality, became denser. 7 family heads, their respective security people, 3 embedded service staff who were not service staff. All of it locked into the specific suspended moment of information landing in a room that doesn't yet know what to do with it. Cassian's face. She looked at it. She'd spent 6 days not looking at this moment directly, and now it was here, and she looked. His face went through something she'd never seen on it before. Not anger, not the managed neutral of a man controlling himself, but something raw, something that was the expression of a person discovering that the ground beneath a thing they'd believed was solid had always been, not hollow, but differently structured than they'd understood. His father, 12 years ago. He'd been 30 in the first year of running the empire, and his father had already made this decision about who the true guardian was. He didn't look at her. He looked at the document. He looked at Solari. "Is it authenticated?" he said. His voice was level. It cost him. She could see it cost him, but it was level. "Witnessed by myself, Aurelius Crane's predecessor, and 2 other founding bosses who are no longer with us. Solari said. I can provide full authentication documentation. The Compact's arbitration clause recognizes it as binding. He paused. I want to be clear that this was not Evelina's doing. She has known about this document for 3 years. She asked me to hold it. Another pause. She told me she hoped she would never need to use it. I believe her. Crane spoke from across the room. Why now? Solari looked at him. Because the events of the last 14 days have demonstrated, in ways I think this room can agree are not ambiguous, that leadership without the right foundation has costs. He did not elaborate. The room didn't need elaboration. The events of the last 14 days were known to everyone present. And then the northeast mechanical room door opened. Not explosively, not violently. It opened the way a door opens when the person behind it is not trying to announce themselves, but is also not hiding. The specific quality of someone who has decided that the performance of concealment is no longer necessary. The door was at the far end of the hall, set into the service corridor access, and the man who walked through it was 63 years old and moved with the particular economy of someone who has been careful about his body for a very long time because he needed it to last. He was not what Evelina had constructed in the 6 days of not looking. She'd built something larger somehow, something more monumental. What walked through the door was a man who was medium height, gray-haired, wearing a dark suit that fit well but not expensively, carrying nothing. He looked like a retired federal administrator. He looked like someone's lawyer. He looked like 1,000 men who moved through systems and left minimal trace. He looked, in the bone structure of his face and the specific quality of his stillness, like Evelina. She stood up. She didn't know she was going to until she was standing. He stopped when he saw her. The room, reading both of them, went very quiet in a different way than before. Sit down, Cassian said from somewhere to her left. Not to her, to Victor Marrow. Low, controlled, the voice of a man who is holding something with both hands. Victor Marrow looked at Cassian. I will, he said. His voice was... It was a voice she recognized in a way she couldn't place immediately, and then she placed it. It was the voice from a memory she had of being 7 years old and sitting at a kitchen table while her father explained something to her about patience, about building, about the difference between what you can see and what is actually there. The same register, slightly lower, 26 years lower. Victor. She said the name. Not Dad. She wasn't ready for that word and might never be, and either way, this was not the moment. You have people in the northeast mechanical room. 4, he said. They're not armed for assault. They're armed for extraction. He looked at her steadily. If tonight had gone the way Celine planned it, I was positioned to pull the surviving family heads through the service corridor and out to vehicles on the north side of the property. Extraction, Cassian said. The flatness in his voice was a particular kind of controlled cold. I've been watching this operation build for 14 months, Victor said. I didn't have enough to stop it from outside. I needed to be inside it, close enough, when it activated. He looked at Evelina. I knew you were building a response. I could see the shape of it in the last 6 days. I knew if I made contact, I would either accelerate your timeline usefully or I would become a variable you couldn't manage. A pause. I chose to be a variable you couldn't manage because I believed, the response you were building was better than what I had, and I didn't want my presence to compromise it. The room was absolutely motionless. You let me think you were dead, Evelina said. Her voice was even, clean, the same controlled register she'd been using for 6 days about the northeast mechanical room, which was not a coincidence and not a performance. It was the only register she had for this right now, because the alternative was something that belonged in a different room and a different time and not here. Yes, he said, for 26 years. Yes. The single syllables dropped into the room like stones into still water, and then every embedded staff member moved at once. Not all 3. One of the 3 Evelina had marked, the one nearest the main entrance, broke first, and the break was not toward a target, it was toward a device concealed under the service station along the north wall. And Evelina shouted one word, now. And Cassian was already moving, crossing the room with the direct velocity of a man who has been waiting for this exact signal. And Crane's people were up, and 2 of the family head's security details converged on the south wall, and the service station went over with the crash of silver and glassware. And the device, a signal jammer, she registered, a communications blackout box, skidded across the floor, and Cassian's foot came down on it and it crunched and went dead before it fully activated. The second embedded staffer reached a door on the east wall. Victor Marrow's 4 people came through the northeast mechanical room door in the same second, and the staffer found herself facing 2 of them in the corridor and stopped. The third, the one Evelina hadn't fully mapped, the one from the different LLC, the one she'd flagged as an unknown, was standing 12 feet from her with a phone in his hand and his thumb moving toward a button that she understood from the operational briefing she'd absorbed over 6 days was the activation signal for the exterior teams, the 2 perimeter positions, the elevated ones. She moved before she'd finished thinking about moving. 3 steps, the table between them going over, her hand coming down on his wrist as the thumb made contact with the screen, but not cleanly, not fully. The signal sent but interrupted. A partial transmission that might or might not reach the exterior positions depending on how their protocol handled degraded signals. And she didn't know their protocol. Nobody knew their protocol because that was Celine's separate cell, and the information wasn't in Petra's map. She had his wrist. He was bigger than her. He used the size correctly, pulling her off balance, and she went into the overturned table and felt the edge of it across her ribs, and the breath went out of her in a sharp, involuntary push that was pain and surprise, and the particular helplessness of lungs that have been percussed and aren't cooperating yet. Then Cassian was there. He came in from the side, and the efficiency of it was not elegant. It was the rough, direct physics of a man who has been in physical confrontations his entire adult life and has learned that the fastest path through them is commitment. The embedded man went down. Cassian stood over him, breathing hard, with his shirt pulled and a cut on his left forearm from the table edge that was producing blood in a thin, steady line that he wasn't registering yet. Evelina got up. She had her hand on her ribs where the table edge had caught her. She was breathing in a controlled way that was managing the pain, not eliminating it. She was upright. That was enough. "The exterior teams," she said, "on it." Crane's voice from across the room. He was on his phone, which meant his exterior people were already moving, which meant the perimeter coordination she'd established 4 days ago with the family heads, combined security, was activating. She'd spent 3 hours on that particular piece of the plan. She hoped those 3 hours had been enough. Outside, the first shot hit the north wall of the estate, high. Not into the room, not into the windows. The elevated position's first round calibrated for a signal that had arrived degraded and uncertain, hitting high as a ranging shot rather than a kill shot. The second shot didn't come, which meant someone on the perimeter had reached the position or the shooter had chosen to abort, and she didn't know which and couldn't know yet. The room was chaos in the structured way that chaos looks when most of the people in it have training, not panic, but rapid movement toward rehearsed positions, security details doing what security details do, family heads getting low and staying there, the noise of overturned furniture and controlled shouting, and the very specific quality of adrenaline in a room full of people who have felt adrenaline before and know how to function inside it. Evelina moved through it toward the center of the room. Her ribs were informing her with every breath that the table edge had done something worth addressing later. She was addressing it later. She reached the center of the room and stood and looked at all of it. The positions she'd mapped and the positions she hadn't. The family heads doing the things she'd briefed them to do. Cassian's people managing the embedded staff. Victor Marrow's 4 extraction personnel in the service corridor, holding a position they'd apparently decided to redirect from extraction to support without being asked. And she understood that the room was not lost. The room was ugly and loud and not fully controlled, and the exterior situation was unknown, but the room was not lost. She found Victor Marrow. He was standing against the east wall, not moving, watching her work the room with an expression she couldn't fully read, something that was not pride exactly, and was not relief exactly, but was in the family of both. The expression of a man looking at something he has watched from a distance for a very long time. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. 2 seconds was not forgiveness, and was not rejection, and was not the conversation they were going to have eventually about 26 years and a grave she'd stood at when she was 17, and a life she'd built in the assumption of his absence. 2 seconds was simply, "I see you. I know you're there. We're not done." Then she turned away because the room needed her. "Crane," she said. "Exterior's clear. Both positions down. No casualties." She breathed. The breath caught on the ribs and she let it anyway. "Solari." The old man had not moved from his table. He was sitting with his hands on top of Emilio Vescari's document, with the composed expression of someone who has decided that 71 years of surviving worse rooms than this earns you the right to sit while others run. "I'm here," he said. "The document," she said, "when this room settles." She looked at him. "We finish what we started." He nodded. Once. The nod of a man who has been waiting a very long time for the right moment and has recognized it. She turned. Cassian was 4 feet from her. The cut on his arm had been wrapped in something. A handkerchief, someone's jacket lining, improvised. He was looking at her with an expression that had been building across 6 days of parallel work, and 4 hours of pre-positioning, and 12 minutes of a room coming apart and reassembling itself around her. And the expression was complicated in ways that neither of them had the language for yet. In this room, in this noise, with Solari's document on the table, and her father against the east wall, and 8 family heads beginning to raise their heads and assess the damage. "It's not over," he said. "No," she said. The room is ours," she said. "What comes next is—" She stopped. Outside, another sound, but not a shot. A vehicle. Fast. The North Drive. Coming toward the estate at a speed that was not a delivery, not a retreat, not any of the ordinary speeds of things that belonged here. She crossed to the window. She looked out. 3 vehicles. Black, armored, the specific profile of something that carried weight and was not concerned about being seen. Moving fast up the North Drive toward the main entrance. Not Celine's people, not the exterior teams that had just been neutralized. Something else. Something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The moment when every major crime family in the country was in one room, and the room was in disarray, and whoever arrived in the next 60 seconds would arrive into a space that hadn't finished reassembling itself. She felt the shape of it lock into place. The second layer. The thing she'd been afraid was there and hadn't been able to fully see. The vehicle stopped 40 yards from the main entrance. Doors opened. 6 men in tactical gear. Not organized crime. The posture was wrong. The gear was wrong. The formation was wrong. Took positions outside, covering the entrance and both flanking walls. And from the rear vehicle, one person stepped out. Walked toward the main entrance at a measured pace. No weapon visible. No gear. A man in a dark suit moving with the controlled calm of someone who is not concerned about being shot because they have calculated very precisely that the people in the building are not going to shoot them. He stopped at the bottom of the entrance steps, looked up at the building. Then he looked directly at the window where Evelina was standing, as if he'd known she would be there, as if the position had been calculated, and his face was a face she didn't recognize, but his posture, the stillness of it, the quality of it, was something she'd just seen in a room 30 feet behind her. She turned around and looked at Victor Marrow. Victor Marrow was looking at the window. His face had gone through something fast and controlled, and what it had landed on was an expression she recognized from her own mirror. The expression of a person who has just encountered the one variable they didn't have fully mapped, the gap in the architecture they'd believed was closed. "Who is that?" she said. Victor Marrow's jaw was tight. He looked at her. In his eyes was something that she hadn't expected from a man who had spent 26 years building and watching and managing from a distance, something that looked unmistakably like fear. "That," he said, "is the reason I came back." His name was Conrad Hale. That was what Victor told her in the 40 seconds between the vehicles stopping on the North Drive and the man in the dark suit reaching the bottom of the entrance steps. 40 seconds in a name and the compressed shape of something that should have taken hours to explain. Conrad Hale, 61 years old, former deputy director of a federal intelligence division that had been quietly dissolved 7 years ago when an internal investigation found that its director had been running parallel operations for private clients using federal resources and federal personnel. The investigation had produced 3 convictions, 1 suicide, and 1 man who had walked away with enough classified operational knowledge to make himself extraordinarily useful to people who needed things done outside the reach of official channels. Conrad Hale had been that man, the one who walked away. Victor had been the internal investigator, the one who built the case, the one who, when it became clear that Hale had enough information about Victor's own methods, the lines he'd crossed, the corners he'd cut in 20 years of field work, to bury him in ways that would survive any immunity arrangement, had made the calculation that disappearing was better than staying and fighting a man who had already proven he could use a system against itself. He'd been protecting her. That was what he said, in those 40 seconds, and Evelina processed it the way she processed everything under pressure, filed it, held it at a distance, refused to let it land fully until she had time to examine it properly. Whether it was true in the way he meant it, or true in a more complicated way, or partly true and partly the story a man tells himself about the choices that cost other people the most, all of that was for later. Right now, Conrad Hale was at the bottom of the entrance steps, and the room behind her had 11 family heads worth of security and 8 family heads who had spent the last 12 minutes in a firefight and were not in a conciliatory posture. And whatever Hale believed he was walking into, he was about to find out he'd miscalculated. "He's going to offer a deal," Victor said. His voice was controlled, but the fear she'd seen in his eyes was still there, working underneath the control. "He always comes with a deal. It's how he operates. He creates a crisis, lets it run to the point where the target is exhausted and uncertain, then arrives at the moment of maximum vulnerability with an offer that sounds like relief." What does he want? The financial architecture. All of it. The holdings, the shell structures, the network of legitimate and illegitimate assets that you've spent 8 years building. He looked at her. He doesn't want to destroy it. He wants to control it, use it as a pipeline for his private client operations. Off-book resource movement, intelligence assets, funding streams that can't be traced. A pause. He's been building toward this for 3 years. Celine was his instrument. The fracture between you and Cassian was his tool. The summit attack was supposed to be the crisis event that made every surviving family head so desperate for stability that they'd accept any structure that offered it, including his, including whatever structure he presented himself as representing. Victor's jaw was tight. He doesn't come alone. The 6 men outside aren't decorative, and he'll have positioned people we haven't found yet, inside, outside, somewhere in the approach. He's had 3 years to prepare this building. She took that in. 3 years. Against her 6 days. Against Petra's map that covered Celine's network and stopped at the northeast mechanical room, which had been Victor's lair, not Hale's. The question of what Hale's lair looked like, how deep it went, what was already positioned that she hadn't found in 6 days of meticulous preparation, that question had no answer yet, which meant she was walking toward the entrance with incomplete information and a room full of exhausted, adrenaline-loaded people behind her, and a man at the bottom of the steps who had been running this operation for 3 years and had arrived at the exact moment he'd calculated would be optimal. She turned around. The room was watching her, all of it, the family heads and their security, and Victor's 4 people, and Cassian and Marco and Solari with his hands still flat on Emilio Viscari's document. 8 different sets of eyes, plus the dozens of security personnel, all oriented toward her, all reading her posture and her face for information about what came next. She looked at Cassian. He was reading her the way he'd been reading her for 6 days, with a new quality of attention, like a man who has spent a long time looking at something without really seeing it and has recently discovered that the scene was available to him all along. She looked at Solari. The old man gave her a minimal nod, confirming what she already knew. She looked at Crane. He looked back with the expression she'd come to associate with him over the last 6 days, the specific steadiness of a man who has decided to trust someone and is committed to that decision. She looked at Remy Delacroix, 26 when she'd pulled his family back from the edge, 32 now. He gave her nothing visible, which was itself a communication. He was ready and waiting and would follow her lead. She turned back to the window. Conrad Hale was still at the bottom of the steps. Patient, performing patience the way someone performs it when they believe time is on their side. She went to the entrance. Cassian came with her. She didn't tell him to. He didn't ask. He simply came, falling into step beside her with the naturalness of something that had been interrupted and was now, quietly, resuming. She opened the main door and walked out onto the top step and looked down at Conrad Hale in the November morning light, and he looked up at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and she used that moment to look at him fully, to take the measure of what 61 years and 3 decades of operating in the gaps between legitimate power and illegitimate use of it had made of a person. What it had made was a man who looked calm, The specific calm of someone who has not been surprised in a very long time because they have designed their situations carefully enough to eliminate surprise as a variable. A man who moved through the world as if the world were a system he'd already mapped, and the mapping had confirmed his position in it. She recognized the quality. She'd been building it in herself for 8 years. The difference, she thought, was the purpose behind it. "Evelina Marrow," he said. His voice was even, carrying, the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to in large rooms. "I'd like to come in." "I know who you are," she said. "Then you know why I'm here." "I know what you want. That's different." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression. The first crack in the performance of patience, something that was reassessment. He'd been told about her. Whatever he'd been told, he was now updating it. "Your network," he said, "your financial architecture. I'm not here to threaten it. I'm here to propose an arrangement that benefits every family in that room. By putting your infrastructure through mine. By stabilizing—" "No." She said it cleanly, not loudly. "I'm going to tell you what's going to happen, and I want you to listen carefully because I won't repeat it." She looked at him steadily. "The 6 men you have positioned on this property's perimeter are going to be identified and detained in the next 15 minutes. Because I have 14 security details in that building who know this property better than your people do and have been pre-positioned for exactly this." She paused. "The people you have inside the building, however many, wherever they are going to surface in the next 10 minutes because every staff member on this property has been photographed and cross-referenced, and the ones who don't match are already known." She paused again. "And you're going to sit down in that room and answer questions from 8 family heads who have spent the last 6 days preparing for this conversation, and then you are going to leave with nothing." Hale looked at her. The performance of calm was still there, but it was working harder now. "You're not in a position—" he started. "Victor," she said without turning around. The door behind her opened. Victor Marrow came out and stood 2 steps above and to her left, which put him slightly elevated, visible, and the effect on Hale's face was the most honest thing she'd seen from him. A rapid, involuntary recalculation. The expression of a man whose most important variable has just appeared in a location it was not supposed to occupy. "He's been in the building for 12 minutes, she said. "His 4 people have your northeast mechanical room access points covered. Your communications with your interior assets have been running through a signal relay that his people intercepted 40 minutes ago." She let that settle. "Everything you've sent since you parked on the North Drive has gone to us." The silence that followed was not the performed patience of a man in control. It was the real silence of a man who is running an equation and arriving at an answer he built his entire operation to avoid. "Come inside," she said. "We'll do this properly." It took 3 hours. Not because the facts were complicated, the facts were, by that point, documented extensively. The financial trails Fenn had spent 6 days reconstructing, the communications Hale's intercepted relay had produced in 40 minutes, Celine's full operational disclosure, which she'd begun providing in the West Side apartment and had continued providing over 6 days with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that the quality of her cooperation was the only remaining currency she had. It took 3 hours because 8 family heads asking questions about a 3-year operation that had been running parallel to their lives, touching their organizations, using their networks as tools without their knowledge. That process is not fast. The anger in the room had texture and weight, and it needed to be spoken, not managed. Evelina let it be spoken. She sat at the center table and she listened and she answered what she could answer, and she said plainly each time when the answer was, "I don't know, but here's how we find out." Hale sat across the table from her for 3 hours. His 6 exterior personnel had been detained in 22 minutes. Not 15, she'd been slightly optimistic. His interior assets had been identified and removed in 14. He was alone in a room with 8 family heads, their security, and the woman he'd spent 3 years trying to either acquire or neutralize. And the experience of that room appeared to be doing something to him. She could see it happening. The slow erosion of the performance, the thing underneath it coming visible the way the structure of a building comes visible when the facing material is stripped. What was underneath was not monstrous. That was the complicated thing. What was underneath was a man who had spent 30 years in systems that used people as instruments and had eventually adopted the logic of those systems so completely that he'd lost the ability to see it as a choice he was making. He wasn't performing indifference. He genuinely didn't understand, at a structural level, why what he'd done was different from what anyone else in the room had done. Crane was the one who said it. 63 years old, 4 assassination attempts, 2 federal investigations, and an instinct for the precise word in a room that was running at him like a freight train. The difference, Crane said, is that none of us have ever pretended to be something other than what we are. Hale looked at him. You used government authority to do criminal things, Crane said. We use criminal authority to do criminal things. The paperwork is different. The pretending is not. Hale was quiet for a long time after that. The room was quiet with him. At the end of the 3rd hour, he signed 3 documents that Evelina had prepared. Not in the 6 days, not in the last 3 hours. She'd drafted them 2 days before the summit, in the 4-hour nights, working on the contingency that Hale would be in the room because her father had told her he would be in the room. The document structured a complete withdrawal, the dissolution of his client relationships as they connected to any of the 8 families' networks, the transfer of the operational intelligence he'd accumulated to a sealed archive accessible only through the compact's joint authority, and a financial accounting that would take 18 months to complete, but would, when complete, return the resources he'd extracted through 3 years of parallel operation. He signed because the alternative was a room full of people with both the motivation and the capability to make the alternative significantly worse. And Hale, underneath everything, was a man who understood cost-benefit analysis. When he left, the room exhaled. Evelina sat at the center table and felt her ribs, which had been informing her for 3 hours that the table edge at the Hargrove estate had cracked something, probably 1, possibly 2, and that this was a matter requiring medical attention. She was going to attend to it. In a few minutes. Solari was watching her from across the room. He still had his hands on Emilio Viscari's document. She looked at Cassian. He was standing at the east window, the same window Remy Delacroix had stood at this morning, calculating sight lines. He was looking out at the grounds, which were now occupied by a small army of security personnel conducting a post-incident sweep in the pale November light. His left arm had been properly bandaged at some point in the last 3 hours. He was holding himself the way he held himself when he was thinking about something that had no clean resolution. Still, deliberate, hands at his sides. She got up. The ribs registered the movement. She went to stand beside him. They were quiet for a moment. Your father, he said. Yes. He's still in the building. I know. You haven't spoken to him since the room settled. No. Another quiet. Outside, November light and the organized activity of people securing a perimeter that had been contested and was now held. The document, Cassian said. His voice was even. She'd been listening for what was underneath it, and what she found was not what she'd expected. Not resentment, not the cold anger of a man whose inheritance has been reframed without his knowledge. Something more complicated. Something that might, with time, become something she could name. He chose you, Cassian said. My father, before I'd done anything to warrant being not chosen, he just knew. He was a careful man, she said. He saw things early. He saw things I didn't. A pause. About you? She was quiet. I spent 14 years not seeing them, Cassian said. Or seeing them and not looking. He turned from the window and looked at her. His face was tired in a way she'd rarely seen it. The specific exhaustion that comes not from physical depletion, but from the internal work of revising a map that has been wrong for a very long time. That's the thing I don't have language for yet. Why I stopped looking. You were busy fighting, she said. Everybody in this room was busy fighting. You were the only one who forgot to look at what he was fighting for. She said it without edge. It was simply true, and they'd both arrived at a place where true things could be said without needing to be softened. He looked at her for a long time. The look of a man examining something he'd held carelessly for a long time and was now holding differently. The title, he said. Supreme Arbiter. Solari's going to bring it up. The compact will bring it up. Solari will second it. Will you accept it? She looked at him. That depends on the room. The room will say yes. I know. Then what does it depend on? She was quiet for a moment, then, whether the person I'd be sharing the architecture with has decided to actually share it, not to manage me, or watch me, or measure his contribution against mine. She held his gaze. Whether we're building the same thing. He didn't answer immediately. Cassian Viscari didn't make promises quickly. It was one of the things she'd respected about him when she still had easy access to respect for him, and she found she still respected it now. He took the question seriously, which meant the answer took time to form. I don't know how to be what you needed me to be, he said finally. I know how to learn it. A pause. Those aren't the same. No, she said. But the first one is useless and the second one might not be. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile, not yet, not today, but the precursor to one, the specific arrangement of features that comes before something lighter. Solari's waiting, she said. I know. They walked back to the center table together. The compact's formal proceedings were brief. They had the weight of long tradition behind them. Language that had been refined over 50 years, structures of authority that had survived more tumult than this, a legitimacy that derived not from any single moment, but from the accumulated weight of all the moments that had led to this one. Solari read from the document. Emilio Viscari's voice, through 20 years of distance and a dead man's careful handwriting, filled the room with the particular authority of someone who had seen further than the people around him and had quietly made provision for what they couldn't yet see. The vote was not unanimous. The Delacroix family abstained, but Remy, honest and precise, said he needed 30 days to review the compact's governance provisions before committing his family's formal endorsement. She respected it. She told him so. The abstention was noted in the record. 6 of the remaining 7 voted in favor. 1, the head of the Vance family, a man named Davis Vance, who had always operated most comfortably inside clear hierarchies, said he would defer to the majority, which was itself a form of yes. The title was conferred without ceremony. Solari said the words, the other family heads acknowledged them, and it was done. And the doing of it felt less like a coronation and more like a recognition, the formal acknowledgement of something that had been true for a long time without being named. She accepted it the way she did most things. She said thank you, and she meant it, and she moved on. Checked. She found her father in the northeast mechanical room. He'd gone back there after the proceedings. She'd watched him go, had let him go, had waited 40 minutes before following. The mechanical room was exactly what its name suggested. Utilities, climate control infrastructure, the functional architecture of a building that needed to be kept at the right temperature for the people inside it. It smelled like machine oil and concrete. Victor Marrow was sitting on a metal chair he'd pulled from somewhere, with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbows, looking at the wall. She came in and closed the door behind her. He looked up. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her across rooms all day, with the intensity of a man who has been denied something for a very long time and is now in the presence of it and doesn't know which need is strongest, the need to speak or the need to simply be in the same room. She sat on a utility case across from him. Her ribs pulled with the movement. She let them. I want to hear it, she said. All of it. From the beginning. He looked at her. Evelina. Not the operational summary, not the strategic justification. She looked at him steadily. The reason you chose a grave over a phone call for 26 years. He was quiet for a long time. His hands were in his lap. Large hands, she registered, with the knuckled evidence of a physical life. Her hands were his hands. She'd always thought they were her mother's. Hale had leverage on me, he said. When the investigation was closing, he came to me with documentation. Things I'd done in the field that couldn't survive scrutiny. Not atrocities, but not things that would play well in a courtroom or in front of my family. He paused. He told me he'd use it. Not against me professionally. I was going into witness protection anyway. Professionally, I was finished. Against you and your mother. She waited. You were 17, he said. Your mother was sick. She died 2 years later. I know that. I tracked it. I couldn't come. Something moved across his face. Not tears. The specific compression of a man who processed grief by pressing it down until it changed into something else. If I'd made contact, Hale would have known I was alive. He would have used you, not as leverage against me, as instruments. He did that. He was good at it. So you protected us by disappearing. Yes. And then Hale went private, and I was out of witness protection, and you were 25, and you'd already built the beginning of what I could see you were building, and you were in the middle of it with Cassian, and I told myself, he stopped. I told myself you were fine, that you didn't need the complication, that a father who showed up 20 years late was more disruption than resource. He looked at his hands, and then I told myself the same thing the next year, and the year after. Until Hale moved on my network. Until Hale moved on your network. And I understood that the reason I'd been telling myself I wasn't disruption was because I was afraid. He looked up. Not of Hale. Not of exposure. Afraid of what you'd say to me when I walked into a room. The mechanical room was quiet. The climate infrastructure hummed at a low frequency. She looked at him for a long time. At his face. Her face, structurally, the bones of it, the specific architecture of the marrow line that she'd believed was hers alone. At his hands, that were her hands, at the 26 years sitting in the space between the metal chair and the utility case, dense and complicated and not reducible to any of the categories she'd been trained to use. You were afraid of me, she said. Yes. Good, she said. You should be. She paused. Not because I'm going to punish you, because the fear means you understand what you cost me. She held his gaze. I spent 26 years building something in the assumption of your absence. Every structure I made, every decision, every time I stood in a room alone because I decided the only reliable architecture was the one I built myself. That was you. That was the gap you left. He didn't look away. I'm not ready to forgive you, she said. I don't know if I will be. I don't know what the shape of this is going forward. She paused. But I know that you came back when it cost you something. And I know that the extraction plan in this room was real. Your people did what you said they'd do when the room went sideways. She looked at the door. That's not nothing. No, he said. It's not enough. No, she agreed. But it's a beginning of something. I don't know what yet. He nodded. A slow, careful nod, the nod of a man who has received something small and is holding it with both hands, because small is what's available, and small is better than nothing. She stood. The ribs. She was going to a hospital in the next hour. The compacts acknowledged the title, she said. Supreme Arbiter. If you have people and resources you're willing to put under that structure, under real oversight, documented, transparent, I'll consider it. He looked at her. Consider it. That's what I said. Not yes. Not yet. He almost smiled. The almost was enough. She went to the door. She stopped with her hand on it. She didn't turn around. What was the name, she said, that you used in witness protection? A pause. Daniel Cross. She absorbed that. Daniel Cross, Celine Cross. She turned around and looked at him. He met her eyes. She's my daughter, he said. From a relationship in the protection program. She was raised by her mother. She found me 4 years ago, when I came out. He paused. I handled that very badly, too. The room was very still. She didn't know, he said, about you, about the operation. She thought she was helping her father take down a criminal network. He looked at the floor. I let her believe that. Evelina stood in the doorway of the northeast mechanical room and let the full shape of it settle. Celine Cross, who had arrived in Cassian's life 14 months ago, who had engineered the photograph and the fracture and the 14 months of damage, was her half-sister, had been used by their father's careful omissions the same way she'd been used by Celine's careful manipulations. Two women built in his image, running at each other in the dark, neither of them knowing the other existed. She thought about Celine's face in the West Side apartment, the fear she'd seen there, the real fear, underneath the calculation. She'd attributed it to exposure, to the collapse of the operation. Maybe some of it had been something else. The specific fear of a person who has been doing things they told themselves were right and has arrived at the moment of finding out they weren't. "Where is she?" Evelina said. "She's been in the family's custody since the West Side building," he said carefully. "Marco's people." She stood for a moment. Then, "I want to talk to her." "Evelina." "Not today," she said. "Not this week, probably, but I want to talk to her." She looked at him. "Whatever you built between the two of us, that's yours to carry. But she's not responsible for what she didn't know." He looked at her with that expression again, the one she couldn't name but was in the family of relief and wasn't quite that. "Your father was a good man," he said quietly. "Douglas Merrow. Better than me." "I know," she said. "I had him until I was 17. It was enough to know the difference." She went through the door. The hospital took 4 hours. 2 cracked ribs, no internal bleeding. She was told to rest, which she understood was a medical recommendation and not a realistic directive. She accepted the compression wrap and the pain management prescription and the instruction sheet, and she folded the instruction sheet and put it in her pocket and went back to work. Marco resigned from the Viscari organization 3 days after the summit. He wrote the letter by hand, which was unusual, and left it on Cassian's desk. He was moving to his daughter's city, a place he'd been planning to move for 2 years and hadn't. Cassian read the letter twice and then called Marco's personal line and said, "The restaurant on the North End, Friday." Marco said yes. They met for 2 hours. What was said between them didn't leave the room. What came out of the room was that Marco would consult, informally, when asked, and that the 19 years were not erased but were also not discarded, and that some things exist in a category that doesn't fit neatly into either forgiveness or condemnation, and both men were old enough to know that category and sit inside it without needing to resolve it. Petra Voss cooperated fully with the Compact's financial audit, 18 months of work that she led, reconstructing everything she'd provided to Celine's operation and documenting the full scope of what Hale's network had accessed. It was the kind of work that cost her something daily, and she did it daily anyway. At the end of 18 months, when the audit was complete, Evelina received the final report and sent Petra a one-line message. "This is the work, nothing else." Petra understood it to mean, "You are not what you did, you are what you do after." She kept the message. Trent Oswald was different. Trent Oswald had made choices that were harder to locate on the spectrum between circumstance and character, and the Compact dealt with him accordingly. She didn't attend that proceeding. She read the summary. Celine Cross took longer. The conversation happened 6 weeks after the summit. A room in a building Evelina chose. Neutral, private, 2 chairs. Celine came in looking the way people look when they've been in an uncertain liminal space for 6 weeks. Thinner, quieter, with the specific quality of someone who has been sitting with consequences and hasn't found the shape of what comes next. They talked for 2 hours. It was not a comfortable conversation. It was not designed to be. Evelina had not come to offer comfort, and Selina had not come expecting it. What they did was talk about what had actually happened, the specific mechanics of each decision, each choice, each point where something could have gone differently and didn't. They did this with the focused attention of 2 people who are each in their own way built for exactly this kind of analysis. At the end of 2 hours, nothing was resolved. Nothing was forgiven. But something had been established that hadn't existed before. A factual record, witnessed by both of them, of what had been done and by whom and why, as accurately as either of them could make it. A foundation. Not for anything specific, just a foundation, in case. "He told me you were dead," Celine said, near the end. "Our father. He told me you died in an accident 10 years ago. He told me he died when I was 17. They looked at each other across the 2 chairs. "We're the same," Celine said, not a question. "We're not the same," Evelina said. "We made different choices." "From the same material." "Yes," she said, "from the same material." That was where it ended. Celine left first. Evelina sat in the empty room for 10 minutes afterward, in the specific quiet of a space that has held a difficult thing and is now just a room again. The Compact changed. It changed slowly, the way large structures change. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of smaller ones, each decision building on the last, each meeting that ended differently than it would have ended a year before, adding its weight to the gradual shift. Evelina held the title of Supreme Arbiter for 2 years before anyone in the underworld publicly called her that without qualification. The qualification, in the first year, was always some version of "for now," or "we'll see," or the particular skepticism that attaches to any new structure until the new structure has been tested by the kind of crisis that tests structures. The crises came, smaller ones, a territorial dispute between the Delacroix and Vance families that would have been a war 18 months earlier, a federal investigation that touched the edges of 3 family operations simultaneously, a leadership succession question in the Crane family when Aurelius Crane's health declined. She handled each one with the same methodology she'd always used. As much truth as the situation could bear, as much patience as the people involved required, and the specific authority of someone who has no personal stake in the outcome, except that it be stable. The qualification dropped off. Not all at once. Like everything real, gradually. Cassian rebuilt differently than he'd built before, which was the point. He was still Cassian Vescari. The directness, the controlled anger, the physical presence in a room, the ability to make a decision under pressure without flinching. Those didn't change. What changed was what he did with the space around those qualities. He consulted. He listened to people he would have dismissed before. He brought questions to Evelina that he would have previously answered himself, not because he lacked the answer, but because he'd discovered that 2 answers were more useful than 1, and that the answer he arrived at through that process was generally better than either answer alone. It was not a romantic restoration. It was something more practical and more durable. The construction of an actual partnership between 2 people who had been occupying the same architecture for 14 years without building together. There were conversations that were hard, and some of them had to be repeated. There were months when the distance between them was greater than others. There were things that didn't resolve cleanly, and probably never would. But there was the work. The work was real, and they did it side by side, and the doing of it built something that was different from what had existed before, which was not nothing. It was possibly more than either of them had known how to build when they were younger and more certain about the shape of things. Victor Marrow submitted his formal request for integration into the compact structure 8 months after the summit. It came in writing, 12 pages, documented assets, personnel, the full scope of what he'd built over 9 years. Evelina read all 12 pages. She submitted it to the compact's joint committee, recused herself from the vote, and let the process run. The vote was 5-3 in favor of conditional integration, with a 2-year probationary review. She told him the result by phone. He said thank you. She said you're welcome. The call lasted 4 minutes. It was the longest conversation they'd had since the mechanical room. They were building something. She didn't know what it was yet. She knew it was being built. The legend, as legends do, assembled itself out of the parts that people could see and the parts they could only infer. What the underworld knew, what it passed forward through the years that followed, in the compressed language of people who understood the weight of certain words, was this: that the woman they'd written off as a broken wife had been, the entire time, the most dangerous person in the room. Not because she carried a weapon or commanded armies or spoke with the kind of authority that comes from volume and force. Because she had understood, before anyone else in her world was willing to understand it, that the most durable power is the kind that other people choose to give you. Not because they have to, not because you've taken everything else away, but because you've demonstrated over time through work that cost you something that you're the person worth choosing. 8 families, 9 years of invisible work, 1 night that could have destroyed everything and didn't. The legend said she'd conquered the underworld. That wasn't accurate. She'd convinced it. The distinction mattered. She made sure it mattered. She made sure it was the thing that was remembered, because the thing that gets remembered is the thing that shapes what comes next. And she had spent her entire adult life thinking about what comes next, and she intended, for as long as she had, to keep doing exactly that.